Rough sketch map, Beersheba operations. October-November 1917. So much for the events of the night and early morning in the Wadi Halgan. In the general scheme, it was arranged that the 181st Brigade on the left of the 179th Brigade should attack and capture the strongly fortified hill known as Hill 1070, which towered up in advance of the general line of the Beersheba defenses. Not until this hill was captured was the main attack to be made. As soon after dawn as light permitted, the operation of wire cutting on the enemy's advanced works on Hill 1070 was commenced by the artillery and was continued, with short checks owing to dust clouds, until 8 a.m., when the 181st Brigade moved to the attack, which was undertaken by the 222nd and 224th Battalions, London Regiment, under cover of an intense barrage and overhead machine gun fire. At 8 a.m., the positions were entered and captured, the artillery lifting on to the reverse slopes. During this phase, the 179th Brigade, led by the 214th and 215th Battalions, were gradually moving forward for the attack on the main positions, in conjunction with the 181st Brigade. At 10 a.m., the latter had reorganized and were reported ready for the next phase, which was preceded by wire cutting on the part of the artillery. This having been completed by 11 a.m., 295 orders were received from the 20th Corps for the assault to take place in conjunction with the 74th Division on the left at 12 p.m. By 12 p.m., the whole of the enemy main positions were in our hands, and our left artillery group were left free to assist the attack of the 74th Division, who were slightly checked on our left. While the operations against Hill 1070 were proceeding, the battalion formed up under cover for their attack, and orders had been previously issued to D Company in the advanced positions that should the Turk leave his trenches on our direct front. As the result of the attack on Hill 1070, he was to be pursued with fire. Odd men had been seen to retire, and the message came through that the Turks were retiring, and D Company lined their ridge and poured fire into the enemy trenches. However, the message of the Turks' retirement, which came from a rear observation post, was not quite correct and was far too sanguine. The retirement was not so wholesale as had been anticipated, and the Turk returned strong retaliatory fire. D Company stuck to their positions, and although suffering heavy casualties, continued to fire at the Turks in the trenches. While this battle of cross-fire was proceeding, orders for the general advance were given, and under the covering fire of the advanced company, the attacking companies B and C, with a company in immediate support, rushed the enemy's line. In spite of heavy opposition, no one hesitated, and the attackers assaulted and captured the trenches, killing the occupants and pursuing with fire those who had retired. The Turks fired until the very last moment, and when our fellows were within bayoneting distance, held up their hands and cried "Kamerad" or Arab. They were poorly clad, and apparently the sprinkling of German NCOs had kept up their morale until the sight of our bayonets. By 12 p.m. the position was in our hands, and a line some 800 yards beyond the trenches was immediately consolidated. Patrols pushed forward, but little was seen of the Turk. Only small groups could be seen in the distance, running away as fast as their legs could take them. In clearing the trenches to our right flank, Private E.J. Cook, C Company, the last unwounded member of his Lewis gun team, greatly distinguished himself. Crawling out of the trench, he engaged a German man-machine gun point-blank, and although the Lewis gun was hit and he was twice severely wounded, he continued to serve his gun until the enemy gun was knocked out, whereupon it was promptly captured by a bombing party. The cavalry, who had worked around the flank from the east of Beersheba, occupied the town that evening, and the reserve 296 battalions of the 60th Division were sent forward to cover our front. The conclusion of the day's planned operations was marked by the concentration of the attacking brigades in the captured positions, with outposts pushed out on the high ground overlooking Beersheba. The 213th, Kensingtons, which had been detailed for this duty in our brigade, succeeded in capturing 277 guns, which had been causing us casualties earlier in the day. To return to the actual attack by the civil service rifles, the whole operation had been a great success, and in spite of considerable casualties, the losses could not be considered too heavy. D Company, the advanced company, had suffered most while giving support to the attacking companies. C Company had the next highest total, as it was their misfortune to advance over the machine-gun-swept valley of the Wadi Halgan. The casualties in B Company were much lighter, as they were able to use the cover of the small branch nullahs in their advance. A company had very few casualties, but this does not reflect that they did not do their share. It was their fortune. The whole battalion had at last been able to display its fighting qualities in a real attack. The battalion's captures included 3 officers and over 50 men, while more than 60 dead Turks were buried by us afterwards in their old trenches. An amusing incident of the final scene of the attack was when the stentorian voice of one of the sergeants of C Company was heard during the lull in the rifle fire, shouting, "All officers and sergeants," an order which had palled on our ears at the close of the numerous practice attacks during our training on the desert. The evening was quiet enough, and the battalion was not worried by Turkish artillery fire, and it was only an hour after the success of the attack was known, when the battalion transport under Lieutenant Pearson and the water camels under Lieutenant Gearing arrived from their hiding place in the Wadi Murtaba, where we had left them the previous evening. Souvenir hunting in the Turkish lines was our evening pastime, but not until search parties had found and collected all the killed and wounded, and every man was accounted for. The night was cold, but men availed themselves of the protection of the trenches, and some of the more fortunate succeeded in obtaining captured tents and bivouac sheets. But these were unpleasant dwellings and smelt horribly. With the dead Turks lying around, the whole place was no health resort. The Turk was a filthy fellow, as his trenches showed, and the whole area was infested with flies. The next day the dead Turks were 297 collected and buried in their trenches. The British guns had fired with great accuracy into the trenches, and in one instance had knocked out a machine gun and its team of 8 men. On the 1st of November, the infantry were employed in clearing the battlefield, while the 519 Field Company, RE, entered the town of Beersheba soon after dawn for the purpose of water development. The captures by the 60th Division included 277 guns, many machine guns, 15 officers and 193 other ranks unwounded, and 5 officers and 85 other ranks wounded. On the morning of the 3rd of November, the battalion moved to the valley on the southeastern outskirts of the town. The whole valley was crowded with British troops and transport. Beersheba as a town appeared to be of little value, but its importance as a stronghold on the flank of the Turkish line was considerable. Water was obtained from the wells which had been quickly repaired by the RE, the Turk having blown up the winding gear before he left. In the town, prisoner-of-war compounds were established, while a still larger compound for the natives and Arabs of the surrounding district was made in the valley outside the town. The soil of the valley, where there is some moisture, is exceedingly rich and is rudely cultivated by the natives. And in the tracts around Beersheba, the Bedouin find ample pasturage for their flocks and herds, which in the evening assemble around the wells, as they did 3,000 years ago. The desert of Beersheba is very beautiful in spring and early summer when the surface is carpeted with herbage and flowers. But later in the year, it is parched and desolate in the extreme, not a tree breaking the monotony of the landscape or the rays of the sun. It was in the latter state when we arrived. On the evening of the 3rd of November, the battalion moved again to Bargut, some 2 miles or more north of the town of Beersheba, but were not privileged to pass through the town, passing it on its western outskirts. At Bargut, a bivouac camp was erected, and the quartermaster's stores and transport sections moved with us. Officers were allowed the benefit of their valises, which had been reduced to 25 lb. in weight, and blankets were issued to the men. Meals were soon prepared, and a day of complete rest away from the filth of the Turkish trenches was thoroughly enjoyed by all. At this time, it had become apparent to the higher command that the enemy had been able to anticipate our threat of enveloping his left flank by a concentration of his reserves on the high ground in the neighborhood of Kuelfe. The corps commander therefore decided to throw our whole weight 298 upon the center of the Turkish defenses, represented by the Kawuka system, and a series of works extending some 5,000 yards to the east, and at the same time occupying the enemy's left flank by the employment of the 53rd Division and mounted troops at Kuelfe. Accordingly, the 60th Division moved over in the direction of Kawuka on the 4th of November, the battalion moving to Wadi Welfare, a distance of 7 or 8 miles as the crow flies. This was a most trying march over sandy desert, and the sand was not of that golden type which one associates with the East when reading books, but was of a dirty black variety, and our memories went back to that first dusty march from Bala to Abu Sitta some months previously. Everyone was covered with black dust, and eyes and nostrils became unbearable. Water was limited and the day's supply had not been received before starting. The water camels had returned to Beersheba, but here the supply was insufficient, and they were redirected to Abu Urjaig, which was about 7 miles in the direction of Gaza, and in quite a different direction to that taken by the brigade. The ground over which we traveled was extremely hilly, and the battalion constantly descended into deep wadis and ascended over the steep ridges for practically the whole of the last 4 miles. It was getting dark, and the difficulties were tremendous, and credit is due to those responsible that the various battalions of the division ever found their allotted areas, most of which were in the beds of deep wadis. The battalion halted about 10 p.m., and an outpost line covering the divisional front was taken up by the 181st Brigade. No water, however, was obtainable. All we knew was that the camels had gone back as far as Beersheba, and knowing the difficulties of the march that we had encountered, the possibility of the camels arriving that night appeared remote. However, shortly after midnight a small voice was heard on the surrounding heights. "Who is down there?" 215th, we shouted. "Thank God," uttered the small voice. "How the devil do you get down there?" No one could say how we had got down into this basin-like dip. In the darkness it appeared to be surrounded by steep cliffs. The small voice was heard no more, but an hour afterwards the swishing of the water in the Fanadis was heard approaching along a branch wadi, and Lieutenant Gearing appeared, followed by his convoy of water camels and their weary leaders. How this officer performed the journey that night from Bargut to Beersheba, and thence to Abu Urjaig, where water was drawn, and eventually across the wilderness to the battalion, which was concealed in one of the many holes in the ground, is beyond imagination. The water camels, with their officer and his company guides, had 299 dragged over a distance of at least 15 miles in the dark. Even Gearing himself cannot explain. In fact, he never attempted, and Sparrow, as our tiny water officer was called, simply grinned and felt pleased. There were heroes in the Battle of Beersheba, but no one was so deservedly popular as Gearing that night. He had done great things through sheer grit, where thousands would have failed, and not without reason. Great was the relief on the arrival of the water camels, and then our minds turned to the transport and quartermaster's stores with its precious rations which had not yet arrived. However, ere long the voice of Lieutenant Pearson, not a small one this time, was heard, and we knew that the gods were with us. The route taken by the battalion had been impossible for wheeled transport, and it had been diverted some 4 miles back on to a different track. Even this second route was extremely difficult, but the transport section stuck to their guns, and after a somewhat lengthy and tedious journey had struck the battalion. It was simply a matter of striking, too. Maps were indistinct, and in the darkness every wadi is a replica of its neighbor. Signposts were badly needed in these parts. However, daylight came, and this put a better complexion on the state of affairs. Officers were called to headquarters and given details of our next attack, which was to be against the center of the Turkish line in Palestine, at a place called Kawuka. The rest of the day was spent in reconnaissance of the ground. Landmarks were few, but all hoped for the best, and compass bearings were taken. Final preparations were made in the evening and rations were issued. Water again presented a difficulty, as the wells at Abu Urjaig had run dry, but it was hoped that the RE would open up a new source during the night. Chapter 34. Kawuka and Rushdie Systems attack Shiria Muntarat Huj Nejaleh and to Gaza via Shiria. The position to be attacked was on the high ground at Kirbet Kawuka, just north of the Beersheba-Gaza Railway and south of Shiria. This was an extensive stretch of trenches, about 4 miles long, which faced southwest from near Samara Bridge to Abu Erira on the Wadi Shiria. The left of this trench system was swung round, forming a strong defensive flank facing southeast, and it was against this flank that the 60th Division was to make its attack. In front of our objectives, stretched an open plain for over a mile, and of course, formed an excellent field of fire for the defenders. The general plan of attack consisted of an enfilade assault from the east to be started by the 74th Division on our right attacking and rolling up the enemy's works east of the actual Kawuka system, followed by our own division, which was to operate against the main defenses, with one brigade of the 10th Division on our left, each division being echeloned back from the right. Careful arrangements were necessary with regard to the timing of the advance of each division, in order to safeguard the possibility of the troops of the 60th and 10th Divisions being enfiladed from the enemy's works, to be attacked by the 74th Division, before the latter had accounted for them. By the flanking attack, it was hoped that the 10th Division on our left would reach the Abu Erira redoubt, a strongly fortified mound on the edge of the Wadi Shiria. In the 179th Brigade, the Westminsters and Kensingtons were to form the attacking battalions, and the civil service were to be in support, the Brigade Reserve being the London Scottish. A second brigade of the division, the 180th Brigade with the London Irish, 218th, and the St. Pancras 219th Battalions, as attacking battalions, were to push forward on our right. The 181st Brigade, of Hill 1070 fame, being the divisional reserve. After the first lines of the enemy's works had been captured, it was intended that the 215th and the 219th Battalions should continue the advance and take the rest of the Kauka 301 system in enfilade as far as the Rushdie system, which adjoined just on the banks of the Wadi Shiria, while the battalions of the 10th Division on our left should concentrate their energies on the strong redoubt at Abu Erira and thus complete the capture of the Turkish positions from the east as far as the Wadi Shiria. During the night of the 56th of November, 1917, the battalion moved from the Wadi Welfare to its position of assembly preparatory to the opening of the action by the 74th Division on our right at 5 a.m. The position of assembly was some 2 miles southeast of the left flank of the Kauka system, and under cover of the undulating ground, we waited for the result of the 74th Divisional attack. One thing which worried us, however, was the fact that our water supply had not yet reached us. The camels which had left for Abu Erjeg on the previous evening had not been heard of since. Just as everyone gave up hope, Gearing and his camels appeared over the crest in front. Here was another adventure of our camel officer. Finding no water at Abu Erjeg, and learning that some was obtainable nearer Beersheba, Gearing trudged back, got the water, and then made a beeline for the Kauka system along the Beersheba-Gaza railway line. True, the route was well defined on the map, but when one thinks of the journey back towards Beersheba from Abu Erjeg Wells is a matter of about 8 miles, and after that a night march of 10 miles towards Kauka on the return, it was a grand performance and an exhibition of determination for which Gearing deserved praise. He had apparently arrived at the position of assembly just previous to the battalion, and seeing no battalion he had pushed on towards the Turks, and when dawn came, seeing nothing in front of him, decided to return, and luckily met us at the appointed place. Water was quickly issued, and everyone was relieved for at least 24 hours. Being in reserve is always a weary job and always one of anxiety. If all goes well in front, it is easy, but should things go all wrong, it is horrible. During the early morning, the 74th Division had gained their objectives, and by 8 a.m. it was decided to commence operations on our divisional front. An artillery bombardment of the Turkish trenches was commenced, and the battalions deployed for the attack. However, from observation it was seen that much of the strong barbed wire entanglements in front of the Turkish lines was still uncut, and it was decided that 2 batteries of RFA should go forward and cut the wire at point-blank range. By this time, the Westminsters on our direct front had advanced to the ridge overlooking the plain in front of the enemy's trenches, and were suffering many casualties. Suddenly, in rear of our battalion, 302 large clouds of dust were seen, and from these clouds came galloping 2 batteries of artillery. On they galloped through the extended lines of the battalion, which lay in support near the railway bridge at Samara, and over the ridge in front until they gained the open plain. Here they unlimbered their guns and opened a rapid rate of fire on the Turkish lines. The battery horses at once returned back over the ridge for cover from the heavy shower of shrapnel which was coming from the enemy gunners. The teams returned at the gallop, but many horses were riderless, and teams were often dragging one of their number either dead or wounded. In front of the ridge, in full view of the enemy, the 2 batteries continued to pour fire on the Turkish entanglements. They were paying for their gallantry, and many wounded artillery officers and men crawled back over the ridge to receive medical attention at the advanced dressing station that had been erected at Samara Bridge, under cover of the embankment. Only a few men finally remained with the guns, and under the command of a corporal, who afterwards received the DCM. They continued to successfully carry out the cutting of the wire. The whole incident was an inspiration to the infantry, and the gallantry of our brothers in the gunners encouraged us in our attack, which commenced to push forward about midday. The battalion followed closely on the heels of the Westminsters, with D Company leading. Extended order with lines about 70 yards intervals in depth was the formation adopted. Once over the ridge, the battalion came under heavy machine gun fire and also a shrapnel barrage. But just ahead, we could see the Westminsters pushing on towards the trench line, which was strongly garrisoned, and with a final rush at 1 p.m. they captured their objective. The battalions on their flanks had also succeeded, and the first lines were won. Without a moment's delay, we, together with the 219th on our right, pursued the enemy and captured many lines of trenches without a great deal of opposition. Occasionally, a machine gun would hold us up for a few minutes, but it was soon outflanked and the line advanced again. All resistance was broken down and the garrisons killed or put to flight. Not until the whole of the Kawuka and Rushdie systems were in British hands did the battalion halt, and then finally took up a position overlooking the Wadi Shiria about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. A defensive line in the vacated trenches was made, and in the distance, across the valley of the Wadi, columns of Turks with their transport could be seen hurrying to get out of range of our artillery fire. The whole attack had been successful, and our casualties were comparatively light. Great losses had been inflicted on the enemy, and many prisoners were 303 captured. The comparative lightness of our casualties was probably largely due to wide extensions, and also to the elan displayed by all ranks who, once they got in close touch with the enemy, pursued him relentlessly, giving him no time to develop counterattacks or occupy a fresh line of resistance. The flanking attack of the 60th Division had swept forward over the trenches, and the 10th Division on our left altered their direction slightly and concentrated on the Arira redoubt, which consisted of a large mound, literally honeycombed with trenches and machine gun emplacements. On the battalion front things soon quieted down, but on the right flank of the division, the Turk had concentrated and was strongly resisting the British advance towards Shiria railway station. At 3 p.m. on the 6th of November, orders were received from the XXDH Corps to establish a strong bridgehead across the Wadi Shiria in order to secure the water supply, the 10th Division being ordered to relieve the 60th Division in the captured works. Accordingly, the 180th and 181st Brigades were ordered to advance and form a bridgehead north of Shiria in order to attain that object, and were supported by the divisional artillery, the 179th Brigade remaining in divisional reserve. The 74th Division were ordered to operate on our right, with their left resting on Kurbit Barada. At 5 p.m. one company from the 180th Brigade had captured Shiria railway station, securing some prisoners and 2 machine guns, while 2 battalions from each brigade prepared to cross the Wadi Shiria and occupy Tel el Shiria, the high ground north of the town. Before evacuating Shiria station, however, the enemy had succeeded in firing a large ammunition dump south of the station, which commenced to explode just previous to the launching of the attack. The conflagration raged for some hours, and so illuminated the country in the vicinity that further progress was rendered temporarily impossible. Nevertheless, the ground over which the attack was to be made was carefully reconnoitered, and at 3 a.m. on the 7th, the attack was launched by the 217th and 220th Battalions of the 180th Brigade west of the railway, and the 181st Brigade was represented by the 222nd and 223rd Battalions east of the railway. The enemy offered a determined resistance, but by 4 a.m. our objectives were gained. During this part of the day's operations, our captures included 4 field guns, 4 machine guns, and over 150 prisoners. The Turks were disinclined to accept their defeat without further efforts, and at 9 a.m. developed a strong counter-attack against the line now held by the 180th Brigade, but this was effectively broken up by concentrated 304 machine gun, Lewis gun and rifle fire, assisted by the supporting artillery, with great loss to the enemy. During the foregoing operations, the 215th Battalion, in common with the remainder of the 179th Brigade, had handed over their captures in the Kawuka and Rushdie systems to the 10th Division, and were brought back a few miles, and remained for the night of the 67th of November in reserve near Samara Bridge. Little rest, however, was possible, as the weather was extremely cold. The next morning was spent in reorganizing after the previous day's attack, and in the early afternoon we were ordered to move to the Wadi Shiria. About 4 p.m. on the 7th, the battalion, with the London Scottish on its left, moved forward from a ridge on the eastern side of the valley of the Wadi, B Company under Captain Lewis leading. While moving across the open, we were heavily shelled. After crossing the Wadi, however, the advance was pressed, and after considerable opposition and stubborn fighting, the enemy was driven back and we established an outpost line on the high ground west of the Wadi. During this advance, B Company, as advance guard, had engaged a considerable force of Turks, but led by the personal dash of their company commander, they pushed forward and inflicted severe losses on the enemy. The battalion soon followed up and passed over a large Turkish camp where B Company had captured an anti-aircraft gun, and the night was spent in digging in. Patrols pushed forward, but no sign of the Turk was found. Taking up this line ended the second phase of our operations in Palestine. Beersheba and Syria had fallen under the pressure of the 60th Division. The following summary from divisional headquarters on the attacks on Kauka and Syria defenses will no doubt be interesting. The total prisoners at the end of this stage amounted to 31 officers and 521 men. During the whole of the day, the division was engaged in severe local fighting, while at times the hostile shell fire, especially in the afternoon, was particularly troublesome, the Turkish command obviously realizing the importance of denying us access to the water supply in the Wadi Shiria. It afterwards transpired from prisoners statements that picked troops had been hastily formed into composite units and entrusted with the defense of the position. The large number of enemy regiments represented among the prisoners lent color to these assertions, the opposing commanders doubtless fully realizing the vital importance of delaying our advance at this point, in order, subsequently, to secure the exposed flank of the retreating Gaza garrison. On the following morning, the 8th of November, the situation had sufficiently cleared for an advance to be made upon Hujj, a few miles northeast of Gaza, where it was thought there would 305 be an efficient water supply. Transport and water camels had joined the battalion, and we were complete to move off about 7 a.m. Cavalry patrols were sent forward to gain touch with the enemy, who was retiring with all speed. The ground was undulating grassland with an occasional outcrop of sandy desert, and movement was fairly easy. The 179th Brigade formed the advance guard of the division, having the 215th Civil Service and 214th London Scottish as its leading battalions, and covering a wide front. Instructions were issued to advance towards the high ground near Kerbet Muntaret, which was known to be occupied by the enemy. For several hours under glorious weather conditions, the brigade pushed forward across the undulating country and found no signs of the enemy except his numerous dumps which he had left hurriedly behind him. About 10 a.m., cavalry patrols brought an information to the effect that the enemy was strongly entrenched on the high ground on the north of the village of Muntaret, and the battalion was deployed for attack. There was a considerable force of Turks near Muntaret, and they were well supported by artillery. The battalion, having C Company under Captain Wills for their advanced guard, opened out into irregular artillery formation, or in other words, blobs of platoons at 150 yards interval. The approach to Muntaret was over an open stretch of country, and while going over the ground the battalion came under very heavy artillery fire and suffered considerable casualties. C Company soon opened out into extended order and advanced to the bottom of Muntaret Hill, which was steep, and except for a small ravine a few feet deep, offered little cover. In spite of the machine gun and rifle fire from the trenches, C Company crept up the hill for the final assault, and within a few hundred yards of the enemy, the men took off their packs and prepared for their final charge. Led by Captain Wills, they captured the position, thus forestalling the cavalry, whose objective it had been, while the London Scottish on their left made a flank attack on the position at the same time. The rest of the battalion soon followed on to the ridge, having also dumped their packs at the foot of the hill. However, the Turkish artillery continued to heavily bombard the captured position, and it was necessary to dig in and consolidate. Further advance was impossible across the plain west of Muntaret, and any attempt to cross the plain would mean considerable casualties from shell fire. The GOC Division, Major General Shee, came up and ordered the Worcester and Warwick Yeomanry to charge the Turkish batteries which were holding up our advance. None of us had had the fortune to see the Balaclava charge in the Crimean War, but it was our privilege to see a similar type of gallantry. 306, and I insert here an account from a newspaper cutting of the charge. On November the 8th, the Londoners, while occupying a ridge less than 2 miles from the enemy lines, came under extremely heavy gun fire. Meanwhile, the yeomanry had come up. The Londoners' commander, who had seen the whole enemy's position and their guns, ordered the yeomanry to charge them. There were 10 troops of Worcester and Warwick yeomanry, commanded by a colonel, master of hounds. He and his men swept over the ridge in successive lines about 2,000 yards from the enemy, raced down the slope across the flat, partly obscured by a mound in front. Over this rise the yeomen spurred their chargers, took the final rise at a terrific pace, the ranks somewhat thinned by gun, machine gun and rifle fire, which the enemy switched off the Londoners soon after trails of dust told of advancing cavalry. The cavalry's target was not so much the infantry as the guns. Giving full-throated cheers, they went straight for the field and heavy pieces. There were 12 guns in action against these valiant boys from the shires, 9 German-made field guns, and 359 howitzers. The field guns banged as fast as the Austrian and German gun crews could load them, but every enemy artillery man was sabred by his piece. The Londoners heard the fire of all the guns stop dead almost at the same moment. After witnessing this magnificent feat of arms and benefiting by the resulting ceasefire from the Turkish guns, a hasty meal was taken and a short halt was made. Later on in the afternoon, under the protection of the London Scottish as advanced guard, the brigade pushed forward in the direction of Hudge. The 214th breasted the high ground at Tor Dimra, near Hudge, about 4 p.m. in the evening of the 8th of November, and were soon followed by the rest of the brigade. It will thus be seen that between 3 a.m. on the 6th of November and 4 p.m. on the 8th, the division marched 12 miles, in the course of which advance the Kauka and Rushdie systems of defensive works were captured, the bridgehead at Shiria stormed, a determined counter-attack repulsed, and the Turkish rearguard driven from Muntarit to beyond Hudge, entailing attacks upon 3 defensive positions on the way. The total captures by the division in the whole operations amounted to 12 guns, 26 machine guns, 51 officers, and 907 other ranks. The following newspaper extract, I think, might be included here without any shadow of a boast, and summarizes our doings from the commencement of the Palestine campaign. The achievements of the London Territorials, who had the hardest part to do in the thrust from our right flank, will rank in the deeds of the war. A distinguished officer of my acquaintance, 307, who has seen nearly 3 years of war in France and watched every movement of the London County Territorials here, told me that he could not speak of these warriors without a lump rising in his throat. This is his considered judgment. These Cockneys are the best men in the world. Their spirits are simply wonderful. I don't think any division ever went into a big show with higher morale. After 3 years of war, it was refreshing to hear the men's earnestly expressed desire to get into action again. These grand fellows went forward with the full bloom upon them. There never was any hesitation. Their discipline was absolutely perfect, and their physique and courage alike magnificent. Their valor was beyond words. The Cockney makes the perfect soldier. In 8 days the men marched 66 miles and fought a number of hot actions. The march may not seem long, but Palestine is not Salisbury Plain. On reaching Tor Dimra near Hudge on the evening of the 8th of November, the battalion was bivouacked on the grassy slopes and waited for water and rations to be brought up from Shiria. During the evening, a large British bombing squadron of some 30 planes flew over our heads and no doubt dropped their missiles with great effect on the columns of retreating Turks fleeing northwards. Late at night water and rations arrived, and these, together with cigarettes made from dried tea leaves, helped everyone to retire for the night satisfied with the day's work. For the next 2 days we remained here, and the battalion was reorganized. Transport came up from Shiria, and fatigue parties were sent back to Muntarit for the packs which we had dumped just before the attack, while others had been left as far back as Shiria by C Company, who it will be remembered started off from the Shiria Wadi as an advance guard. Unfortunately, the water supply at Hudge was not so promising as expected, and the damage done to the wells by the retreating Turk did not help matters. Horses and mules were sent out in all directions, without finding a sufficient supply, and lack of water became so acute that the artillery men nearby sacrificed their own limited supply for their horses. The difficulty of our own transport is best described by the following letter from Lieutenant Pearson, our transport officer at the time. On one occasion we left the lines at 5 a.m. with the animals to go about 10 miles for water and had to be back ready to move off at 2 p.m. When we arrived at the given place, there were several thousands of Australian cavalry horses, artillery horses, and several infantry units, animals with only one 30-foot-long portable trough. The Australians' horses had not had any water for over 36 hours, so you can imagine there was no system or order. The horses could not be held back. We had to return without 308 watering and arrived back at 2 p.m. In the meantime, the battalion had received further orders to the effect that they would not move until next day. After feeding the animals, and after the men had had a snack, we were told there was a well near at hand. We went in search and found it was about 60 feet deep and had to pull up a bucketful at a time by means of a long rope. Anyway, we arrived back at 1 a.m., the men and animals only having had one meal at midday between 5 a.m. and 1 a.m. the next day. We moved off at 8 a.m. the same morning. The foregoing incident actually occurred while we were at Tor Dimra on November 9, 1917. From the heights at Tor Dimra, the result of our recent fighting could be well appreciated. A few miles to the southwest could be seen the town of Gaza, the scene of heavy fighting some months previously, while to the west stretched the coastal plain which ran up country as far as Jaffa. Frontal attacks on Gaza had proved unsuccessful earlier in the year, and therefore General Allenby decided to attack from a flank. The line of attack commenced at Beersheba and was made in a northwesterly direction, rolling up the Turkish line from the east, and hoping at the same time to reach the north of Gaza in time to cut off the garrison. While this flank movement was in progress, local frontal raids on Gaza were made under heavy artillery bombardments from both land and sea. However, the Turkish leaders were able to thwart the full intention of the scheme, and by their strong resistance, by powerful flank guards at Kawuka, Shiria and Muntarit, were enabled to give time for their troops at Gaza to retire north with minimum losses. However, as soon as the Gaza front gave way, the XX Ist Corps under our old divisional commander, General E.S. Bulfin, relentlessly pursued the Turks as far as Jaffa. Except for the 53rd Division, our own corps, the XXDH, was withdrawn from the pursuit, and in order to assist the advance, much of our corps transport was lent to the XX Ist Corps. The 53rd Division just mentioned had been kept at Kuelfe just north of Beersheba since the beginning of the offensive, and had fought manfully against repeated attacks, and thereby protected the right flank of our advance across Palestine. On the 11th of November, the battalion moved a few miles northeast to the Wadi Jemimiah, where the whole of the surrounding country was covered with well-planned trenches, and all the valleys covered with machine gun emplacements. But the numerous ammunition dumps round about signified how hastily the Turk had withdrawn without making a strong resistance. Only a day was spent here, and on the 13th we moved still farther north to Nejala, a pleasant spot after the filth and dust which existed around Jeminiah. The Route 309 was lined with large collections of war material which had been left by the retreating Turk, and everywhere was desolate and uninviting. Not until a mile or so from Nejala did the scenery improve, and then a stretch of undulating grassland presented itself, a restful change for our tired eyes after a lengthy stay on the glaring yellow desert. A few flocks of sheep strayed over the pastureland, and the quaintly dressed shepherds, at last, presented to us a fair representation of biblical Palestine as we had imagined it in our youth. This was the first clean, healthy spot, free from sand and the filth which the Turks always left behind them, we had struck since our arrival at Balaa. For 3 days the battalion remained here on these grassy hillsides, overlooking a wide plain of pasture land to the north. Just near the camping ground, a stream of crystal-clear water flowed, and bathing parades were again indulged in. To give the Britisher his due, he does love cleanliness, and even through the recent advance most of the men had used a portion of their limited ration for purposes of shaving, although a proper wash was out of the question. No parades were ordered, and a restful time was spent at Nejala. However, difficulties arose with regard to supplies, much of our corps transport having been lent to the other corps pursuing the enemy. Consequently, the battalion was ordered to return to Shiria. As I have already said, the Turk reveled in filth and pollution, and no better illustration could be seen than the Shiria area, where he had apparently had a large base camp since the early days of the war. For miles around Shiria, the place literally stank, and flies were present in their millions. The ground was strewn with dead Turks, camels, horses, and mules, and the presence of these carcasses did not improve the polluted atmosphere. However, the desert was expansive, and camps were arranged as far from this debris as possible. While we had been fighting during the past few weeks, miracles had been performed by the ASC and RE. The former corps had worked well, and supply dumps had been advanced with rapidity. camel and horse transport working in conjunction with the railways in the captured area. The latter corps had repaired the Turkish railways and used the captured rolling stock to good purpose. Other sections of Aris had exploited the wells and obtained good supplies of water in the Wadi Shiria. November the 17th, just after the arrival in the Shiria area, was known as Parcel Day. It was the first post since our departure from our desert line on the Wadi Guz. Not only letters arrived but huge bags of parcels. Nearly every man received a parcel. The owners of many, however, were not to be found. Some had given their lives for their country, while others 310 had been sent to base hospitals either wounded or sick. But each platoon or mess made short work of these and divided the spoil. It was an unwritten law and not stealing. Luxuries were plentiful, and hundreds of tea parties and dinner parties were held that evening. Every unit, however, has its grousers. Not that they mean any harm, but it is their privilege as British Tommies. They could not legitimately grouse this night with all the good things around, so they turned their morbid thoughts to treks and predicted a move on the morrow, when everyone would be laden with luxuries. Their prophecies came true, and the following morning camp was struck, and the battalion marched towards Gaza as far as Muntarit. On the 19th of November, the march was resumed to the outskirts of the town of Gaza. The day's march was not a great distance, but the downpour of heavy rain in the evening drenched all. This was the commencement of the rainy season in Palestine. Chapter 35. The march from Gaza up country, Enab, the capture of Jerusalem, Tel El Ful Bayer. At Gaza the battalion bivouacked just to the north of the town. Town was perhaps a complimentary term for Gaza at that time, for it was in a deplorable state. The proud town of the Philistines, and the scene of Samson's deathly triumph, had been most thoroughly treated to every type of missile known to the British forces, from rifle bullet to the 12-inch naval projectile, and there was ample evidence of the efficacy of that treatment. Scarcely a whole wall remained. Big gun emplacements built of concrete and iron rails, though skillfully hidden, had been utterly destroyed, and most of the trenches flattened out. Before these had stood formidable obstacles in the shape of cactus hedges, which had proved themselves more efficient than any barbed wire, but what remained of these was liberally sprinkled with shrapnel holes. In short, Gaza had been made as unhealthy as it was possible for us to have made it, and at last the Turk had been made to quit, though not without a struggle. Through the center of the town, a clearing had been made, and the broad-gauge railway was being rapidly advanced. The methods of the RE railway construction companies are well worth a short description. They were the essence of efficiency. First, the RE officer with a few satellites carrying the necessary instruments would prospect and decide the direction of the line, and he was quickly followed by a large gang of the Egyptian labor corps, who, armed with a tool similar to an adze, but without that instrument's sharp edge, and a bag similar to a carpenter's, would immediately set to work to clear the ground and make the necessary cutting or embankment. The sight of some hundreds of these natives swarming over the position was exactly like an overturned ant-hill. Everyone seemed to run in different directions, and to the uninitiated confusion appeared to reign supreme. But the work was completed at a pace which would have made a Kakani trade union delegate weep with anguish. When the necessary alteration to the landscape had been effected, more laborers would appear, each carrying a huge railway sleeper, which was dumped roughly 312 in position, later to be arranged properly and leveled by soldier platelayers. This work was no sooner completed than lengths of rail were dumped upon and quickly secured to the sleepers by means of fish spikes. The rails were then trimmed, leveled and bolted together, and very shortly afterwards were being used by the construction train, which with its supply of material could thus closely follow the quickly moving construction gangs. The permanent way thus made could not, it is true, attempt to rival that to which we were accustomed, but an adequate supply of transport was absolutely necessary for the success of the EEF at that time. And in those days, no branch of the services worked more quickly or efficiently than the railway construction companies to maintain the supply line. After a short rest at Gaza, we commenced our march northwards on the 19th of November, 1917. Our actual destination was unknown, but the lying jade had been busy, and the magical word, Jerusalem, was ever on her lips. Private soldiers or humble subalterns do not presume to understand the ways of an army commander. They have, in the famous game of war, not even the status of a pawn, but nevertheless are forever weighing the pros and cons of each, and every movement they are required to make, and thus if anyone had, but 2 short months ago, been rash enough to suggest that Beersheba was the opening move of a game that was to end in the capture of the Holy City, they would have suggested that the unfortunate one had been disobeying divisional orders, and by not wearing his helmet had caught a touch of the sun. But the situation had rapidly changed since the dreary days of the Gambly defenses, and Jerusalem was in fact well within our reach. True it was that our grip had not been closed upon it, but the days of the Turk in the home of Christianity were forever numbered. Rain had fallen heavily for a short time during our stay at Gaza, and though its advent had been a welcome change, we later had cause to regret the hot sunny days of the Sinai Desert. The flat coastal plain which runs north from Gaza has been cultivated land ever since biblical times, and is the most fertile spot in the whole of Palestine, and in consequence the most thickly populated, though the total number in the whole land, apart from the cities such as Gaza, Jaffa, Lud, and Jerusalem, would disgrace a small English county. A plentiful crop of barley which had been grown had been recently cut. Indeed, rumor had it that a famous Scotch whiskey firm had nearly failed owing to the lack of supplies from Palestine. The course of our march was set through fields of stubble. When it was hot and dry, there arose stifling clouds of dust, and when wet the sticky nature of the ground could even bring a 313 Caterpillar tractor to a standstill. The change, however, from endless sand was at first welcome, and we found great delight in passing through the native villages. These were amazing collections of mud huts. Windows were unknown, and of sanitary arrangements there were none. Yet the inhabitants, though inexpressibly dirty, seemed quite happy and contented with their lot. When opportunity arose, we supplemented our meager rations by purchasing eggs, figs, nuts, and oranges. The last named were most welcome. We had seen no vegetables for months, and the supply of fruit undoubtedly did much to dispel the ill effects of this enforced denial of greens. The number to be obtained for one Egyptian piaster, 212d. English, varied, but the native drove a hard bargain if you failed to obtain at least 6 magnificent Jaffa oranges for that small sum. Many indeed did show in their dealings with us characteristics of the descendants of the 12 tribes with which we are all familiar, but at least one of them met his match. One famous youth, noticing that a colored Egyptian banknote had a remarkable purchasing power, was smitten with a brilliant idea. Hurriedly quitting the village marketplace, he produced a gaudy label from a tin of jam, and succeeding in persuading a hoary-headed old extortioner to part with the whole of his stock of oranges, on the understanding that the aforesaid label was worth untold gold. That youth, of course, had no right to be a private soldier, foot-slogging through the Holy Land. He had missed his vocation, which was that of a company promoter in the aeroplane or munition line at home. So many oranges were eaten on that march that, later on, drafts marching up from Gaza were known to have followed this trail of orange peel and found their way across Palestine to Jerusalem. Marching is a thirsty business in any country, and when for the most part the march is made enveloped in clouds of dust, it becomes even a still thirstier business. We had had long training in that fine art of marching from dawn to dusk without having recourse to the water bottle, and that training stood us in good stead in those November days. The supply of water was an ever-present anxiety with the higher command, and in spite of the exploration of wells by the Royal Engineers, we were only allowed the meager amount of 1 water bottle full per man per diem, and this had to be carefully husbanded if the owner desired to partake of tea ration at the end of the day. He who could not produce a mugful of water could not draw a mugful of tea, and this was strictly adhered to. It was our great good fortune during the whole campaign never to miss our daily supply of water, and for that great credit is due to Lieutenant Gearing, who was in charge of the water camels. He had an uncanny knack of finding his way to us 314 over trackless unknown country, and wherever we bivouacked for the night, he was sure to arrive very shortly afterwards with his precious convoy of water camels. His trials cannot here be recorded, and their recital on paper would never convey an adequate impression of his difficulties, and yet no one in the battalion ever did better work. Such deeds are not rewarded with decorations, but perhaps this tardy recognition of his work will in some way convey to him our appreciation of his excellent work. Water was not the only difficulty. Rations were very short. We had been for weeks on what the ASC called mobile rations, which was the official name for 4 biscuits, 1 tin of bully beef, and a small ration of tea and sugar for each man every 24 hours. This was occasionally supplemented by jam, but even then it was a wearisome diet. Smokes became very scarce, and the old substitute of dried tea leaves was often in use. Fuel was conspicuous by its absence, as also were mails. However, we did not grumble too much when we realized the difficulties of transport. The railway embankment built over the Wadi Guz had been twice swept away by floods, and all rations, etc., had to be brought by motor lorry from Gaza. And as there were no roads, it was a trying experience for the ASC, particularly as two of the motor transport companies had been but recently formed and rushed up from the base, and immediately given the task of supplying a rapidly moving division over 50-60 miles of trackless country. In spite of all, we pushed on through Beit Hanun, Deir Siniad, Mejdal, Mesmaiah, and Junction Station, until about the 24th of November, when at Latran we set foot on the first metalled road we had seen since leaving Kantara. Latran is about midway between Jaffa and Jerusalem, and a few miles to the northeast, the road enters the Judean hills at Bab el Wad. And after negotiating two ranges of hills, approximately 2,500 feet high, it reaches Jerusalem, which is set at the top of a third and higher cluster of hills. The effect of marching on a hard road after months of sand and soft soil was soon felt, and our feet and footwear quickly began to show signs of wear. Boots, the leather of which had perished through exposure and lack of grease, were soon worn through, and even the oldest and best of soldiers suffered from sore feet. The road itself, though labeled metalled, was not in good condition. The Turk was ever notorious for the bad state in which he kept his communications, and this one was no exception to the rule. It had not been repaired since the visit of the Kaiser many years before, and the defects were soon aggravated by the passage of much transport. It was an 315 exhausting climb, and it lasted for a long time. The road was bounded on the one side for the most part by a precipice, and on the other by the steep hillside, except for a few places where it ran through deep cuttings, and one could speculate on the chances of success of any troops attempting to force such a road against the opposition of a few well-armed British troops, and the result of the speculations was distinctly unfavorable to the attackers. Yet the Turk had been hurried from hill to hill, with little loss to our troops. As we toiled upwards, we momentarily expected to get our first view of the Holy City. We knew definitely by that time that such was our objective, and with the words of Holy Writ in our minds, "A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid," we eagerly awaited the vision. That moment was however denied us for many a day, and it is a matter of conjecture whether in any of our minds we felt satisfied when that view was obtained. It is rather ironical, but nevertheless a fact, that the first portion of Jerusalem we saw was of German origin, the tall tower of the Kaiser's palace on the Mount of Olives. Crown copyright, by permission Imperial War Museum. Road to Jerusalem near Bab el Wad. Crown copyright, by permission Imperial War Museum. Jebel Kurantul, Mount of Temptation and Jericho. Occupied by London troops February 2, 1918, the traditional scene of Christ's temptation. To face page 314. We eventually reached the crest of the first range of hills at Anab, and descending into the valley on the opposite side, we entered an area which in comparison with the deadly wastes left miles behind seemed like paradise. The hillsides were pleasantly wooded, the road was good, fuel and water were in abundance, and a little monastery was discovered to possess a stock of most excellent wine made from the fruit of the vines, for the cultivation of which the hillsides were terraced. We remained near Anab for some days and enjoyed life. One company was unlucky and was sent up to relieve a post of the 75th Division, which had been sorely tried in holding what they had gallantly won, but the remainder of the battalion enjoyed a well-earned rest. The troops were in great need of it, but the animals were in a much worse condition. Owing to the difficulties of maintaining supplies, the transport animals had for nearly a month been on half rations, and had done a tremendous amount of very hard work. They were tired and worn, and in fact were so hungry that the steady diminution of the size of the tail boards of the limber, and the amount of leather harness eaten by the animals caused the transport officer, Lieutenant Pearson, many anxious moments. The remaining brigades of the division moved up behind us, and the division took over the right of the line from Soba through Kushel, Nebi Samuel to Beit Izzah. Nebi Samuel, so called by the reason of its being the traditional burying place of Samuel, was a distinct thorn in the side of the Turks. This high hill overlooked Jerusalem and threatened the road to the north from that city, and our presence there was much 316 resented by the Turks. They made strenuous endeavors to recapture the hill, but all their efforts failed. When the 180th Brigade took over the hill, There was on the top of it a splendid mosque with a graceful minaret. But Boche gunners with the Turk were no better in their respect for things religious than their brethren in France, and it was not long before the minaret and mosque were utterly destroyed by a concentrated bombardment of heavy metal. The final preparations for the attack on Jerusalem having been completed, the 74th Division, which had by this time come up in rear, took over Nebi Samuel from the 180th Brigade, and we concentrated near Soba. The 179th Brigade were to attack the left of the Turkish position near Ain Karim, and if possible effect a junction with the 53rd Division, which was struggling up the Hebron Road. The 180th Brigade were to attack up the main Jaffa-Jerusalem Road through Colony and Lifta, while the 181st Brigade were in reserve. On the night 78th December we advanced from Soba, crossed the Wadi Surar, and at 3 a.m. on the 8th of December the brigade attacked the high ground overlooking the Wadi Surar and south of Ain Karim and were speedily successful. This operation was a difficult one, and its success was essential to the main operation. The whole brigade with mountain batteries descended the precipitous hillside in single file. It was a wretched night with no glimmer of moonlight to assist us, and the rain fell heavily. The whole route was fraught with much danger to life and limb, but was negotiated without a casualty. The main attack was delivered by the other regiments in the brigade, but we were called upon to assist. C Company, who had taken the Jura Heights and were subjected to 3 determined counterattacks, the last 2 of which C Company helped to break up, were sent to the help of the Kensingtons. Meanwhile Captain Leach, our medical officer, hearing that our sister battalion had sustained over 100 casualties, came up under heavy fire from 2 machine guns which were still holding out in a building of Ain Karim in our rear. He and our stretcher-bearers, particularly Privates Davy and Eels, rendered most gallant service to our own and the Kensington wounded, for which, and for their timely assistance, C Company earned the grateful thanks of that regiment's CO by 4 a.m. All objectives had been gained, and 1 hour later the main attack up the Lifter Road commenced. Much stubborn resistance was met with, as the Turk was well dug in, and the progress of the attack was retarded by the fact that our help was not forthcoming as had been expected. This was not our fault. We had hoped to effect a junction 317 with the 53rd Division, and then advance together, but the 53rd were by then many miles away fighting hard to come to our assistance. The resistance they met with delayed them, and we in consequence were subjected to much hostile artillery fire from our right flank and unable to push forward. The weather was very bad. A high and bitterly cold wind and torrential rains made conditions extremely uncomfortable. We were clad only in tropical kit, had been exposed to the elements on hills nearly 3,000 feet high for over 24 hours, and were by no means in a happy frame of mind. The Turk was also making himself extremely objectionable, and we were supplied with many gifts in the shape of shells. Our opinions of Jerusalem at that time are not fit to be recorded here, and they did not change for many a long day. Near Lifta the Turk was making strenuous efforts to keep us out, but by 3 p.m. he was dislodged by a gallant bayonet attack, and Lifta was occupied at dusk. We pushed on to the outskirts of Jerusalem and remained in battle outposts. That night pandemonium reigned in the Holy City. The Turk was evacuating as quickly as possible, so quickly that when a patrol of the 180th Brigade advanced from Lifta in the early morning of the 9th of December, it was met by the mayor, who proffered the surrender of the city. Major General Shi was instructed to accept it, and did so at 1 p.m., and Jerusalem passed forever out of the dominion of the Turks. We were billeted that night in an empty school in a garden named Abraham's Vineyard, and next day moving out to the north, took up an outpost line at Shaphat on the Jerusalem-Nablus-Shechem road, where we remained till the 15th of December, when we returned to billets in Jerusalem, in the school in Abraham's Vineyard. Jerusalem was the first town worthy of the name that we had seen since leaving Ismailia, and to many the prospects held out when viewed from afar off was not fulfilled on closer inspection. The weather was cold and wet, but we made light of such minor discomforts, being so overcome with the novelty of being in Jerusalem. The idea seemed so fantastic. This ancient city, which for centuries had been a bone of contention between East and West, was at last in Christian hands, and withal in the hands of the London Division. True it is that our Welsh friends of the 53rd Division had lent a very helping hand by struggling up the Hebron Road, but nevertheless, it was to the London Division that credit was due for the releasing of this home of Christianity from the hands of its enemies. Yet withal it was difficult to arouse any real sentiment concerning this famous city. It was inexpressibly dirty. The people comprised all the nations 318 and races known in biblical times and since, and they, like the city, were very dirty. Of sanitation there appeared to be no sign, and outside the Jaffa Gate the main water cistern, which from its accumulation of rainwater provided drink for the greater part of the city, had to all appearances not been cleansed since the time of Herod. The railway station, a comparatively modern addition, was in a state of chaos, although perhaps the RFC were to blame for that. The fine ancient wall which, with the temple site and the water cisterns, was one of the only original things left from biblical times, had been cut into at the request of the Kaiser, and a hideous clock tower crowned with a large clock by Dents had been built in the gap made. Appallingly dirty fellows in charge of a few decrepit animals attached to a kind of cab stood near the clock tower plying for hire, but their condition was such that it needed no general routine order to forbid us to use them. Of the holy places within the city, we were allowed only a view from the outside until some months later, but we studiously traversed the whole city, armed with the Padre as guide and a Bible as guidebook. We visited the temple site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, David's Tower, and traversed the so-called Via Dolorosa, complete with its sites of the supposed halts of Christ during his journey with the cross. The Pool of Siloam was an offensively smelling puddle of dirty water, whilst the brook Kidron was a mere trickle. Indeed, the whole aspect of the city dispelled in the minds of most of us that vision we had often had in our youth, and had forgotten of Jerusalem the Golden. Whatever faith we had in the genuineness of the holy places was sorely tested, and it was not long before we came to the conclusion that one either had to view everything through rosy-tinted spectacles and believe all that was said, or be convinced that most of it was sham and accordingly see the castles built up in our boyhood rudely shattered by a simple historical fact. Nevertheless, Jerusalem possessed a great attraction for us. Outside, the old city had grown up a comparatively new town with many modern buildings, and to the north was a genuine Church of England, St. George's Cathedral. The shops began to display their goods openly for the first time for 3 years, and the natives offered fruit, figs, oranges, nuts, etc., for sale in the marketplaces. And indeed it was an event of some importance to be able to walk the streets of the famous city Jerusalem and feel that one was really a crusader, a descendant of those hardy people who 800 years ago had borne the heat and the burden of the day clad not in khaki drill, but in armor. The amount of correspondence which was handed over to the Army Postal Service was enormous, and 319 written, let it be noted, for the main part on German paper by German pencils. And in many a home in England today is treasured a divisional Christmas card for 1917 sent from Jerusalem. We had ideas of being able to spend our Christmas in the city, but that was not to be, and on Christmas Eve, 1917, we relieved the 180th Brigade in the line Beit Hanana, Tel El Ful astride the Nablus Road. The weather became very bad, and the climatic conditions were by no means pleasant. The line was held on the west by the Kensingtons in front of Hanning, and on the east by the Westminsters in front of Tel El Ful, and we were in support. Bivouacs had just been erected, and we were settling down for a wet cold night when the colonel sent for company commanders. Headquarters was situated in an old tomb cut in the solid rock, and entering, we saw the CO seated at the head of a roughly made table, and near him his senior officers. When we had all arrived, he said, "Just listen while I read out the brigadier's Christmas greetings. It is expected that the enemy will attack at dawn on Christmas morning." It was an awkward moment, but the colonel at once relieved the temporary gloom which had settled on us during the reading of the message by adding at the end, "And England expects that every one will give the Turk a hearty Christmas greeting." Dispositions were soon made. A company moved out in support of the Kensingtons at Beit Hanana and D Company to the Westminsters, who were holding the line at Tel El Ful. The companies were very weak, and D Company was reinforced by No. 11 platoon of C Company, the remainder of the battalion moving to a hill behind Tel El Ful. It was midnight before the move was complete, and nothing remained but to wait for dawn. It was a most appalling night. A high wind and torrential rain make life very unpleasant when one is in bivouacs on top of a hill 3,000 feet high. Our bivouacs were flooded, and we were soaked to the skin, but it was realized if the Turk attacked under such conditions, he would be a hardier man than we expected. Christmas morning broke, and the gray light from the east disclosed one of the most dismal pictures dawn could ever disclose. Jerusalem, almost hidden in driving rain on Christmas morning. As we expected, the attack did not take place, though we could not but realize the irony of our dear friends at home, hurrying off to church to sing, "Christians awake, salute the happy morn," when the dear ones for whom they prayed had just spent the most miserable night of their existence in waiting for a dawn which 320 in no circumstances could have been called happy. The rain continued all Christmas Day, until the morning of the 26th, when the sun came out and cheered us. That the attack was imminent we all knew, but the sun revived our spirits, and by midday we were willing to tackle all the Turks in Asia. We had suffered several casualties from exposure, but a supply of whale oil for the feet did much to check wholesale sickness. Information came through that the attack really would take place on the 27th, and a few minutes after midnight of the 2627th, the Turks pushed in an advanced post in front of Tel El Ful. The first main attack came about 1 hour later, supported by heavy artillery fire on the Westminsters position in front of Tel El Ful. Shortly afterwards, the Kensingtons were also heavily attacked to the west of that hill. The Turk had been reinforced by new troops from the Caucasus and was making a desperate effort to retake Jerusalem, so the brunt of this attack fell on our positions, which covered the main road, and only road from the north. 2 platoons of D Company were soon sent up under Lieutenant T.H.E. Clark to reinforce the left company of the Westminsters, and the struggle was intense. 8 attacks in all were made on the position in front of Tel El Ful, and in the heaviest, just before dawn, the Turks succeeded in effecting a footing in the main positions. The situation was grave, and Colonel Gordon Clark of the Westminsters thereupon ordered the officer in charge of D Company, Lieutenant Hutchison, to take the remainder of his company and eject the Turk with the bayonet. This counter-attack made by No. 16 Platoon, D Company, and No. 11 Platoon, C, under Lieutenant R.H. Harris, M.C. Bulldog Harris of the 1st Battalion, under the command of the OC-D Company, in spite of severe shell fire, ejected the Turk from the main position, though not without sustaining severe losses. Lieutenant Harris, with a party of 7 or 8 men, became detached and was surrounded. They fought to the last, and Harris, accounting for at least 3 of the enemy himself with the bayonet, was killed. All the remainder of his party were either killed or were wounded and taken prisoners. These were the only prisoners we lost in Palestine, but their loss was due solely to the vigor with which they pushed home their attack. The remainder of the company lost heavily and had, when they took over the line from which they had ejected the Turk, but 50% of their original strength. Junction was made with Lieutenant Clark, and the line was reorganized and held throughout the remainder of the day, in spite of repeated attacks, which were supported by heavy artillery shelling. The following letter, received by our CO a few days later, gives an appreciation of the value of the work done. Photo by Turner and Drinkwater, Hull. 2nd Lieut. R.H. Harris, M.C. Killed in action, Palestine, 1917. To face page 320. Headquarters, 60th Division. 31st December, 1917. My dear Bistie, I visited the post held by the platoons of your battalion in front of Tel El Ful. The number of dead, their attitude, their closeness to the parapet, the bomb and shell holes, are all witnesses to the grim struggle of your splendid men. They must have inflicted not less than 300 casualties in all. The fact that they maintained their line intact against heavy odds and a brave and determined enemy is an incident of which your battalion may well be proud. I should much like to know who commanded the platoons and how many casualties they had. Accept my warmest congratulations on their courage and determination. Yours sincerely. Signed, A.C. Temperley, Lieutenant Colonel. General Staff, 60th Division. On the left, in front of Beit Hanina, A Company did no less glorious work. After being in the line in the early morning, they were withdrawn until about midday, when the Turk made his final onslaught on our line. He pressed his attack right up to the stone breastworks which had been erected and fought with determination. As on the right in the early morning, the situation was critical, and a company were called up to assist. In company with the Kensingtons, they counterattacked with the bayonet and forced the enemy back. In this action, Lieutenant R.W.G. Andrews greatly distinguished himself. A story of the 27th December would be very incomplete without mention of the gallantry of the other ranks, and particularly the stretcher-bearers. These latter went out time after time, under heavy rifle and machine gun fire, to bring in wounded comrades. Private Martin, D Company, went out with a fellow stretcher-bearer, Ridley, some 40 or 50 yards from cover, and placed a wounded man on a stretcher. Whilst doing this, Ridley was shot through the head. Martin thereupon, in spite of the fact that he was much the smaller of the two men, got his pal on his back and commenced to carry him in. He stopped exhausted halfway, and after a brief rest shouldered his burden again and got him under cover only to find that he was dead. Quite undismayed, he again went out with another man and succeeded in bringing in the first man safely. All this was done under aimed rifle and machine gun fire. Martin afterwards was awarded the military medal, although recommended for the VC. When told of his reward a few days later, all he said was, "What about Ridley, sir? I did no more than he did." And that epitomizes the self-sacrificing spirit of the stretcher-bearers. Martin was killed in France some 322 months later while gallantly attending the wounded under heavy fire. A and D companies were withdrawn from the line on the evening of the 27th December, and joining up with the remainder of the battalion, followed up the Turkish retirement northward next day, which resulted from the crushing blow by the 10th and 74th Divisions on the Turks' right flank. The importance of the operations near Jerusalem at Christmas, 1917, were never properly realized at home. They were the result of the one really determined counter-attack that the Turk made during the whole of the Palestine campaign. Jerusalem and the crumpling of our right flank was his objective, and to attain it, he brought down several new divisions from the Caucasus. But the result to him was not a victory but a real defeat, crushing casualties, and an immediate loss of many more miles of country. Referring to our subsequent advance, Mr. W. T. Massey, the official press correspondent at General Headquarters, said in his dispatch, dated 31st December, 1917, "The rapid advance in most difficult country is due to the overwhelming defeat of the Turkish attempt to retake Jerusalem on December 27th, when, after resisting desperate attacks, the British delivered a masterly counterstroke, causing the Turks, who had suffered tremendous losses, to yield almost impregnable positions and fall back along the Shechem-Nablus road, leaving in our firm possession points of great strategical importance." General Allenby, in his dispatch referring to the same operations, says, "The heaviest fighting took place to the east of Jerusalem-Nablus road. Repeated attacks were made against Tel El-Ful, a conspicuous hill from which Jerusalem and the intervening ground can be overlooked. The attacks were made by picked troops and pressed with great determination. At only one point did the enemy succeed in reaching the main line of defense, but he was driven out at once by the local reserves." And later, referring to the western side of the road, where a company were engaged, he says, "At 12 p.m. the enemy launched an unexpected attack of great strength against the whole front. In places he reached our main line of defense, but these successes were short-lived, for, in each case, local counterattacks carried out immediately were successful in restoring the line. After the defeat of the Turk, the division pursued him, and a couple of days later were successful in capturing the heights at Boer, about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. While passing through Ram Allah on the way to Boer, some of the men we had lost when fighting at Tel El-Ful were found wounded, having been left behind by the Turks. Chapter 36. Ibn Obed Bethany Jebel Ektif, Jerusalem Mukmaz. The capture of the Boer heights, and driving the Turk towards Nablus, completed the capture of Jerusalem, as far as attacks from the north of the city were concerned, but on the east and southeast there was still danger. On the 1st January, 1918, after a night in Jerusalem, the battalion was ordered to take up an outpost line to the southeast of the town from Sir Bahir just off the Bethlehem road, running in a northeasterly direction via Khirbet Jub-Rum to Abu Dis, just outside Bethany. The line therefore formed a defense about 3 or 4 miles from the city. Sir Bahir was held by D Company, Khirbet Jub-Rum by C Company, while A and B were at Abu Dis. The day was fine when the battalion marched out of the town during the morning, but before proper communication could be established along the line, a heavy rain fell, and the whole countryside was enveloped in a thick mist. Each company, therefore, had to form its own strong points and wait for dawn on the following day. In the darkness and mist, it was impossible to move over the rough hilly country, and patrol work was limited to a couple of 100 yards. However, the next morning in brilliant sunshine patrols were pushed out, but no sign of the Turk was to be seen. Communication with the flank companies was obtained, and rations and water supplies were sent out to each of the companies in the line. Everyone looked forward to a quiet tour of outpost duty. D Company, however, received orders to push out as far as the monastery at Ibn Obid on the Wadi en-Nar, which in biblical times was known as the Brook Kidron, and was 3 miles southeast of Sur Bahir. The new line, therefore, ran from north to south, from Abu Dis to Ibn Obid, passing through Jub-ur-Rum. The country over which the line ran was composed of stony hills with deep wadis in the valleys, sometimes 500 feet below the summit of the surrounding hills. The monastery at Ibn Obid, which was the southern terminus of the line, stood on the top of the cliffs of the Wadi en-Nar, which descended steeply for some 800 feet to the bed of the wadi. The monastery had been the scene of some heavy fighting, a 324 few weeks previous to our arrival, in which a battalion of the Middlesex Regiment had fought with distinction and had driven off repeated attacks of the Turks. When D Company, however, came upon the scene, everything was peaceful. Only a few monks lived in the monastery, and they were soon packed off to Jerusalem, in case they acted as enemy spies. On the 10th January, the whole battalion was relieved by the 213th Battalion, Kensingtons, on this outpost line, and moved to Bethany. At Bethany, 3 companies were billeted in the local school and a monastery nearby, while a company took up an outpost position at Sniper's Post, overlooking the Jericho Road, about a mile or so ahead of the battalion. Here we reorganized our specialist sections, which had suffered heavy losses in the fighting around Jerusalem during the latter part of December. A new draft had just arrived from England, and they were initiated into the art of warfare in the East by constant training over the local hills. The remainder of the battalion was employed on road making, or perhaps I should say making cart tracks through the wadis near Abu Dis, and occasionally a strong force of about 200 men would reconnoiter the ground in front of the Turkish positions along the Jericho Road, especially towards the Arak Ibrahim Caves, some 4 miles away, where the Turk had a considerable garrison. On the 20th D Company relieved A Company at Sniper's Post, but except for the occasional noise of 2 captured field guns at Bethany, which were used against the Turks at Arak Ibrahim Caves, there was no sound of war. 6 days later, the battalion moved back to Jerusalem and billeted in some empty schools in the German part of the city, while many of the officers were placed in private houses. The journey was full of interest, and the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, St. Stephen's Gate, were passed among other famous sights. On the way we met a Jewish funeral. We thought that the Macedonian method of carrying the coffin lid in front of the procession, with the body exposed to the eyes of the curious, as being a crude method, but this funeral was even more gruesome. The party rushed along the road at a great pace, and the corpse wrapped in a blanket was merely suspended by cord at the head and foot to a long pole, which was carried on the shoulders of 2 men, while the body limply swung from side to side as they hurried along. During this stay in the city of Jerusalem, parties under the expert guidance of our Padre, Rev. G.C. Cavalier, were allowed to visit the holy places in the town. I need hardly recite the wonders of the Holy City, as many guidebooks will do so far better. As far as the battalion was concerned, we enjoyed the 325 privilege of seeing these ancient biblical landmarks. Souvenir hunting in the shops and the purchasing of foodstuffs, chiefly fruit and bread, which was of a greenish hue when cut, and of the consistency of gluten, formed the chief amusement during the day. At night time, however, the 2 divisional concert parties, the Barnstormers and Roosters, both of which had made great hits in Cairo and Alexandria, were in full swing at their respective temporary theaters, and provided us with splendid recreation. Major Grisel from the 74th Division took over command of the battalion on the 28th January, our own commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bisty, having been granted leave to the United Kingdom. Danger, however, soon occurred from the epidemics of disease and fever in the city, and the battalion was moved out of the town to tents and bivouacs on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, headquarters being in a sheik's house nearby. The camping site was just off the Nablus Road, overlooking the Garden of Gethsemane, and was on dry, dusty terraces of barren land, which in a few days became a wretched quagmire. Heavy torrents of rain continually poured down for 4 days and 4 nights without a break, and everyone was swamped out and miserable. Refuge each night was taken in the divisional theaters, and large parties would march across the city in the pouring rain, simply for the comfortable shelter of the theater. When the weather had cleared a little, the battalion was employed on road making, and one day an exhibition of Sangar building was given by a company of Indian troops who were past masters in hill fighting. It was, however, unhealthy to live in the mud of the camp, and the battalion was moved up to Sir John Gray Hill's house at the top of the hill. It was a large, desolate mansion, overlooking the valley of the Jericho Road, while in the far distance the Moab Mountains could be seen. A short stay of 2 days here, and the battalion was moved to bivouacs in the wadis of the Abu Hindi Wadi on the 13th of February, where preparations were made for an attack eastwards over the hills towards the Jericho Plain. The Turkish line east of Jerusalem consisted of a line of entrenched strongholds on the hills some 8 miles from the city. The southern extremity of the line rested on Muntar, a high hill just east of Ibn Obid Monastery, and came north via Jebel Ektif, Talat ed Dum, across the Jericho Road to the Erek Ibrahim Caves, and thence over Ras el Tawil to the deep ravine of the Wadi Ferrar. The British line ran practically parallel to this line, a few miles nearer the city, with Ibn Obid forming the right or south flank, 326, and ran north via Jub-ur-Rum, Abu Dis, Sniper's Post, on to the Jericho Road, and thence north over Sufra to Mukmaz. The intention of the attack was to drive the Turk from the high ground on the west of the Jordan Plain, and thereby render the Holy City immune from attack from the east. The advance was to be made in 3 distinct phases as follows. The 3 brigades of the 60th Division were holding the line in this sector, and the objectives were allotted as follows. A 181st Brigade, Ras el Tawil. B 180th Brigade, Erek Ibrahim Caves and Talat ed Dum. C 179th Brigade, Muntar and Jebel Ektif. In the 179th Brigade, the 214th Battalion, London Scottish, were given the hill of Muntar as their objective, and they concentrated in the depths of the Wadi en-Nar near Ibn Obid. During the night of the 19th of February, the companies deployed and crept up the hillside under cover of darkness. At dawn, the trenches were heavily bombarded, and the attack was pushed home under the artillery support. The hill was captured, and fortunately, the strength and resistance of the enemy had been overestimated, with the result that the Scottish casualties were small. The same morning, the 180th Brigade were successful and captured the caves at Erek Ibrahim in the center of the Turkish line with comparatively few casualties. Further north, however, the 181st Brigade had met with strong opposition at Ras el Tawil, and after several hours of heavy fighting gained possession of the hill and put to flight a strong force of Turks. Casualties, however, on both sides were fairly heavy. The first phase of the advance had proved successful, and the battalions detailed for the second day's move were able to push forward and prepare for the assaults on Jebel Ektif and Talat ed Dum. Like the first day's operations, the second day's attacks resulted in the objectives being taken, although the fighting was more strenuous as the objectives were surrounded by more difficult country, which provided the defenders with better cover. The Turk, finding himself overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, retired over the hills to the Jordan Valley, covering his withdrawal with machine gun rearguards so that the third day's work came under the heading of peaceful penetration. Thus, the 60th Division was master of the Jordan Valley from the commanding heights on the west of the plain, 327, and the possibility of an attack on Jerusalem from the east had disappeared. To return to the particular part in these operations performed by the 215th Battalion, it will be remembered that they were in bivouacs in the Wadi Hindi on the 13th February. For the few days previous to the commencement of the advance, we were occupied in road making in the Wadi beds to assist the bringing forward of guns, ambulances, and transport for the attack. Reconnaissances were also made towards the front, and on one of these stunts, our brigade major, Captain Shurston, was seriously wounded in the leg. On the early morning of the 19th of February, we were awakened by the artillery fire from Abu Dis, where our heavies were assisting the attack of the London Scottish on Muntar. A few hours later, we learnt of the success, and realized it was now our turn. During the morning, the battalion gradually moved along the valley of the Wadi Hindi under cover of the surrounding heights, D Company forming the advance guard. After advancing some 3 miles, the battalion was halted, as further advance was impossible by day. Under the cover of an outpost line, the battalion rested until darkness came, thus making further progress possible. During the afternoon, patrols were sent out, and reconnaissance towards Jebel Ektif was made, and resulted in a sharp skirmish with the Turkish advanced posts, but no casualties occurred to our party, although several Turks were seen to be carried away on stretchers. About 6 p.m., the order was given to advance to the attack, and 3 platoons of D Company were ordered to make good the high ground west of the deep ravine in front of Jebel Ektif, while a fourth platoon under Sergeant Cross moved along the wadi bed to a point where the deep wadi in front of Jebel Ektif branched off to the left. When these platoons had pushed ahead sufficiently, the remainder of the battalion marched along the wadi in order to reach the line of deployment before daybreak. Probably of all the country over which the battalion had passed throughout its stay in both Salonika and Palestine, none could compare with the deep ravines and precipitous cliffs over which the advanced guard had to pass. And if this statement is accepted, there is no need for further comment on the difficulty of the advance. To move forward, a matter of 3 miles occupied a full 6 hours of hard climbing over ridges and difficult descents down precipices. The night was exceedingly dark, and great credit is due to Lieutenants Clark and Neal, platoon commanders in D Company, for maintaining their direction and reaching their objective. The men behaved splendidly and struggled along through this wretched patch of the Holy Land. 328. Fortunately, no opposition in strength was met, except an occasional volley of fire from the Turkish advanced posts, but they soon retired to their main position on Jebel Ektif. Great caution, however, was necessary as large bodies of the enemy had been seen that afternoon leaving Jebel Ektif and advancing towards our lines. When, however, the advanced guard had reached the limit of their advance, the battalion pushed along the bed of the stony wadi and were supposed to halt at the junction of the wadi in front of Jebel Ektif and the main wadi, where they hoped to turn the corner into their place of deployment. However, the noise had apparently disturbed the Turk, and he constantly poured machine gun fire on to this junction corner. It was therefore found necessary to find another way into the Jebel Ektif Wadi, and the only way was to climb the steep, precipice-like sides of the main wadi on to the high ground held by D Company. This was accomplished, but how, no one can tell. When the battalion with its Lewis guns, regimental aid post, and signaling mules reached the crest, dawn was appearing in the east. It was decided, therefore, to make a hurried descent into the Jebel Ektif Wadi in spite of the casual fire from the enemy's snipers and machine guns. Luckily, the going down into the second wadi was easier and more speedily accomplished than the climb from the first wadi. And just as daylight arrived, the tail of the battalion disappeared into the bed of Jebel Ektif Wadi, out of sight of the Turks. Once in the bottom of the wadi, the companies sorted themselves out and prepared for the actual assault, A and B being the attacking companies, C in support, and D in reserve. It had been arranged that the 213th Kensingtons were to assault the position on our left, having approached the wadi at Jebel Ektif by a night march on a parallel route to the one we had taken. Unfortunately, the ground over which the Kensingtons had to pass had proved too difficult, and when daylight came they found themselves perched on a precipice unable to cross the deep ravine before them. At 7 o'clock on the morning of the 20th February, the artillery opened up a heavy bombardment on the hill. The advance up the hillside, described officially as trickling forward, should have taken place under this barrage, while the assault was timed for 8 o'clock when the barrage was to lift. Unfortunately, little or no progress could be made owing to the fact that the heavies were shelling the benchmark, some 1,000 yards behind the enemy's forward lines, thereby leaving the enemy's machine guns undisturbed, while at the same time other machine guns on our left raked us. Those, in fact, which should have been concentrating their attention on our brother 329 Battalion, the Kensingtons, who had been so unfortunate in their advance march. At 8 o'clock, when we should have assaulted, the attack was therefore hung up for a while. An hour later, a forward observation officer having come up, a second barrage was fired for 15 minutes, concentrating accurately on the forward Turkish trenches. At the same time, C Company was taken from support, and by means of quick concealed movement succeeded in moving to our left flank, thereby taking up the position and role in the action which should have been the Kensingtons. C Company was able to make some ground, and also was able to give great assistance to A and B companies by bringing enfilade fire to bear on the snipers and machine guns that were holding them up. As this second barrage lifted, the battalion assaulted the steep hill, and in spite of heavy frontal fire were successful in capturing the first line. By this time, the two companies of the Queen's Westminsters had come up onto our left, and under the gallant leadership of Captain Flower, silenced the machine guns which had enfiladed our attack. When the first ridge was gained, it was found that a valley beyond led to the second ridge, and here the Turks were again strongly resisting. After a breather, however, the charge was given, and the men, led by Captain Wills and Company Sergeant Major Oldcorn of C Company, rushed over the valley and gained the second ridge only to find a still further ridge strongly held. Machine gun fire from the flank was still causing considerable casualties to us, but after a breather, the battalion assaulted the third ridge, and thus completed the capture of Jebel Ektif. The Turks fled down the precipitous slopes, into the Jordan Valley, and could be seen collecting in small groups as though preparing for a counterattack. The battalion's casualties in this action numbered about 100. Further north of Jebel Ektif, the London Irish of the 180th Brigade had succeeded in capturing Talat ed Dum after heavy fighting. The Turk, however, still had isolated machine guns on the hills between the recently captured positions of Jebel Ektif and Talat ed Dum, and these poured a persistent fire into our flank. In the late afternoon, the Kensingtons came up on our left, and soon cleared the ground of these irritating machine guns, and by the evening everything was quiet except for an occasional shell from a Turkish battery, which could be seen some couple of miles away across the Jordan Plain, well out of the range of our guns. Just before dark, we had a splendid view of the Jericho Plain. No other valley in the world presents such extraordinary 330 physical features. None other has been the subject of such various theories as to its origin and character. From our position on the eastern edge of Jebel Ektif, the ground sloped steeply for about 2,000 feet to the flat plain below, which stretched for over 20 miles to the foothills of the Moab Mountains. Winding through the plain, the river Jordan could be seen in places where its steep banks were broken by small branch ravines, while to the south, the dismal flat water of the Dead Sea was visible. The only town on this extensive plain was Jericho, and as the light failed, it appeared as a dead city of mud huts. The following morning, the 21st February, the London Scottish were moved on to the plain as far as the white ruins of Neba Musa, and Australian cavalry patrolled the Jericho area. The Turk had crossed the Jordan, and all was quiet. About midday, however, 4 enemy planes flew over our positions, and but for a remarkable cloud which suddenly enveloped the hill, would no doubt have poured bullets into our bivouacs. When the cloud lifted, they were nowhere to be seen. For 2 days the battalion remained on the heights of Jebel Ektif, and although free from fighting, it was a most strenuous business carrying rations and water from the quartermaster's stores and transport which were now in the Jebel Ektif Wadi, from which the attack had started, some 600 or 700 feet below the summit of the hill. On the 23rd February, the battalion was ordered to move as far back as Jerusalem. Chapter 37. Jerusalem, Mukmaz, Jericho, East Salt, Wadi el-Jib. On the 23rd of February the battalion left Jebel Ektif, and after some discussion in the Wadi near the transport lines, some companies chose the route via the Wadi Hindi, Abu Dis and Bethany, while others struck across country over a distinct track, supposed to be the remains of a pilgrim's road to the Jordan, and thence along the main Jerusalem-Jericho road via Bethany. Which was the better route has not been decided, sufficient to say that the troops hated both. Rain poured down when we were halfway to Jerusalem, and when Sir John Grey Hill's house was reached late at night, no one had the heart to argue as to the better way from Jebel Ektif. On the following day, Sunday, we availed ourselves of the rest. In the evening, many attended divine service in the huge chapel of the German Emperor's Palace, near to the Mount of Olives. It is a huge structure, and a wonderful view of the surrounding country could be obtained from the tower. It was used as a corps headquarters during the operations around Jerusalem, not quite the purpose for which the Kaiser had intended it. The chapel was wonderfully decorated inside, but the two things which struck one as being odd and even profane were the paneling of the altar, which was decorated by the crests of each of the Kaiser's sons, and the ceiling, which was divided into 2 parts, one containing a beautiful painting of the Son of God, while the other contained, equally well painted, a picture of the Kaiser and his wife sitting on their thrones. On the 25th of February, the battalion moved from Jerusalem, further north to Mukmaz. The route was along the Nablus Road as far as Ram, a distance of about 5 miles, and here we struck off the main road eastwards over the roughly made military roads as far as Jebba. Here the route became more difficult, and was across rough mountain paths, making it necessary at times for the battalion to march in single file. The transport could not travel the whole route, and was halted near Mukmaz, from which point camels and mules carried stores and rations. The battalion halted on the hills near et Tala, and outposts facing the Jericho Plain were taken up by D Company 332. The distance as the crow flies from Jebel Ektif to et Tala was about 5 miles, but the country was of such a nature that the only route between these points entailed a long march through Jerusalem, a distance of nearly 20 miles. Just in front of the outpost position was Jebel Kurantal, reputed to be the Mount of Temptation. For nearly a month of delightful weather, all was peaceful on our immediate front. Occasionally patrols pushed out to the front and explored the deep ravines leading on to the Jericho plain, but only once were we fired on by the Turks, and then from a considerable range, probably 1,000 yards. Acting on the principle, however, that the devil finds work for idle hands to do, that wonderful pastime for tired troops was revived, namely road-making, and large fatigue parties were so employed. It had been a source of great interest to some of us that nowhere behind the Turkish lines, away from the four main roads which run north to Nablus, south to Bethlehem, east to Jericho, and west to Jaffa from the city of Jerusalem, could any trace be found of ways of communication, except an occasional mule track, whereas, behind our own lines, a network of specially constructed tracks was always to be found. It was a mystery to us how the Turks ever moved their guns, men and supplies in sufficient quantity to even replace normal daily wastage. But the fact that after the repulse of the counter-attack on Jerusalem in December 1917, a Turkish quartermaster surrendered to one of our posts because he, a quartermaster, could not get sufficient food, may indicate that they suffered from shortages through lack of roads and means of communication. We had often gazed at dawn on the gorgeous sunrise over the mountains of Moab and seen the dull silver of the Dead Sea turn to burnished gold. We had also seen that white streak across the dark plain of Jericho, which denoted the presence of that wonderful stream, the Jordan, but the thought that the words of the old song, "One more river to cross," would ever come literally true never entered our heads. If it did, we gave it no serious thought. We had heard of the Jordan Valley and its appalling heat in summer, for had not the Turk left in Jericho a note to the effect that they would return in the autumn to bury us, and also were familiar with the expression, "go to Jericho." So, indeed, had no wish to spend any time there. If the shades of the hereafter are hotter than the scene of Joshua's miracle, they can have no terrors for the 60th London Division. Brass hats, however, have ever since their creation been seers of visions and dreamers of dreams, but their decision to give us an Easter holiday in Moab could only have been the result of a nightmare. Accordingly, the 21st March, 1918, saw the 60th Division concentrated with the Anzac Mounted Division in the Jordan 333 Valley, ready to carry out a raid on a scale unheard of in the annals of the war. That is, penetrating over 30 miles into enemy territory of the wildest nature, with the destruction of the Hejaz Railway at Annam as the objective. The civil service rifles crossed the river on the afternoon of the 23rd of March by a pontoon bridge at Makhedet Hajla, which had been gallantly constructed under fire by the engineers, and moved up the left bank of the river, passing on our way the Commander-in-Chief, General Allenby, and the Duke of Connaught, who was on a tour of inspection well within range of the Turkish field artillery. Our object to the north was to rout out a nest of machine guns, which was delaying the crossing at the El Gorani Ford some 5 miles to the north. But to our delight, this particular body had realized the threat to their rear, and had him shied. We bivouacked for the night in the Wadi Nimrin, near Enkala, and at 5 a.m. the next day moved out in support of the London Scottish and the Queen's Westminsters, who attacked the hill of El Had which, held in force by the Turk, barred the second means of approach to Ease Salt, that by way of the Wadi Arseniat. A Bosch pip-squeak battery, which endeavored to hinder us, drew the attention upon itself of one of our own 45 howitzer batteries, and speedily ceased fire. We were not called upon to assist, and were fortunate to witness a most successful attack in open order against an extended position. The sight of lines of London infantry advancing calmly under a heavy enemy field and machine gun fire, and also of the final assault with the bayonet, was one to be remembered and treasured. El Had was taken with little loss to our forces, and we moved up to the foothills and bivouacked in the Wadi Arseniat, near El Had. The river Jordan at Makhedet Hajla is 1,200 feet below sea level, and El Had is 846 feet above, and the weather changed, becoming steadily worse. The night was wet and bitterly cold, and we were not sorry to start at 7 a.m. the next day on our advance up the Arseniat track to Ease Salt Ramoth Gilead. In heavy rain up a most slippery, muddy and stony track, we twalled upwards and upwards as advanced guard to the brigade, which, with a regiment of Australian light horse and mountain battery, was soon strung out in single file. Communication was maintained with the 181st Brigade on the main East Salt Road by means of a portable wireless installation, carried by the light horse. After a most exhausting climb of nearly 3,000 feet, we arrived on the outskirts of East Salt about 1 p.m., thoroughly fatigued and soaked to the skin. The weather was bitterly cold, and it was felt all the more, for in a little over 24 hours, we had moved from the tropical 334 heat of the Jordan Valley up some 4,800 feet to the climatic conditions in winter of the top of a mountain higher than Snowdon. The Turk had retired hurriedly and offered little opposition, and further progress being impossible owing to our exhausted state, we bivouacked and slept in inches of mud. The night was disturbed by much rifle fire from East Salt, and at dawn on the 26th, No. 16 platoon was detailed to reconnoiter the town. Under Lieutenant Andrew, who was acting as O.C. company, they entered the town to find no trace of the Turk, and to receive a tumultuous welcome from the population who, during the night, had kept up a feu de joie from their housetops, which noise we had interpreted as hostile rifle fire. We were the first British infantry to enter East Salt, for it was not until some hours later that the 181st Brigade, which had been moving up the main road from Shunut Nimrin, arrived in the town. Supplies were lacking owing to the great difficulty of getting the camels up the slippery mountain track, and an officer was detailed to proceed to the 181st Brigade and bring back some water camels, water being the pressing need. The remainder of the division moved up the Annam Road, and the defense of East Salt was left to the civil service rifles. The same evening the battalion moved out to the northeast of the town, to Kefi Huda, 3,597 feet, and took up a position covering the route from the north to East Salt. News came through of a possible attack by some 2,000 Circassian cavalry, and arrangements were at once made for their proper reception. Time available was short, but by toiling all night under the protection of standing patrols of the Australian Light Horse, dawn on the Maundy Thursday saw the 215th snugly settled ready behind stone sangars. Firing started with the first light of dawn and continued throughout the day, but no serious attack was attempted by the Turk. At dawn on Good Friday, under cover of a thick mist, the Turks attacked with bombs a post in the center of the battalion. An energetic reply with Mills hand and rifle grenades, and a burst of fire from a machine gun resulted in their speedy repulse. The mist suddenly lifted, and opposite a neighboring post was discovered a Turkish captain and his batman, with their kit complete. He was brought in, and it transpired that he had set out with 200 men to assault the hill under cover of the mist. But his left flank got too far forward and pressed the attack before the remainder were ready, and they in consequence, like the burglar who heard the noise overhead, thought all was lost and fled, leaving their officer stranded on the hillside. In his pocket was found a small diagram which showed the relative positions of all our Lewis and machine guns, and this caused no little searching in the mind, for we had, as we thought, 335,336 camouflaged them successfully. However, even if he, the captain, knew, his snipers apparently did not, for though throughout the weekend we were continually sniped, one of our Lewis guns, though continually in action, had not a shot fired at it. Sketch map of operations around Jerusalem. There were constant alarms, and on the night of the 31st March, D Company repulsed 4 separate determined attacks on their position, with no loss to themselves. On the right and left, A and B companies were troubled slightly, but the brunt of the defense of East Salt fell on the center of the line. The situation was nevertheless serious, and the 214th and 216th battalions were brought back to East Salt. The battalion was relieved on the night of the 31st of March, and at dawn moved down to the south side of East Salt. The divisional withdrawal from Annam, the assault on which place had not been entirely successful, was now in full swing, and the majority of the Armenian population of East Salt, terrified at the prospect of the return of the terrible Turk, was hastily evacuating the town. The road, which had been churned up by men, horses, guns, and wheeled transport, was inches deep in liquid mud, and was packed with refugees. Old men and boys, women and children of all ages, with their household goods in large bundles on their backs, staggered along obsessed with great fear. Their flight was terrible, and not a few of us hurriedly realized that it is not only troops who suffer in wartime. We could give little assistance. Our own baggage wagons were already overburdened and our own loads were heavy, but we did what we could. At 8 a.m. on the 1st of April, Easter Monday, After standing in full marching order in the mud for a solid hour, we started our retirement, and though hindered and hampered by the crowd of refugees which surged and swayed either side of us, we marched steadily until 5 a.m. Next day, when we emerged from the hills at Shunat Nimrin and bivouacked for a few hours, after which we continued, and crossing the Jordan River by the Goraniye Ford, we arrived at a position in the Wadi Numaya about 3 p.m., having covered a distance of about 30 miles since 8 p.m. the previous night. Everyone was footsore, dirty, unshaven, with 7 days' growth of beard, and thoroughly tired, but we soon settled down to our first proper night's rest for 9 days, during which time we had experienced almost the extremes of heat and cold, and had marched about 70 miles through some of the most atrocious country our army has ever operated in. The other brigades had fared even worse than we had, but the whole division had covered itself with honor, and had no reason to be 337 dispirited at the apparent failure of its novel enterprise. Gains in warfare are not measured by territory alone, and the influence of this raid, indeed it was almost a campaign, had a far-reaching effect on the strategy of the Palestine campaign. We were happy, on our return to the Jordan Valley, to welcome back from leave in England our commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bisty, and the battalion, though it had worked well under its temporary commander, was delighted to see its commanding officer back once again, and it speaks much for the spirit of comradeship of the regiment that no one was perhaps more pleased to be with us again than Colonel Bisty himself. After a day's rest in the valley, we moved once again up towards Jerusalem and halted at Talat ed Dum for 24 hours. At Talat ed Dum, there is a wayside house reputed to be the Good Samaritan Inn of biblical times. After this short rest, we again pushed up the old Jericho road, which we had come to know almost as well as the Strand. On arriving at Jerusalem, we were again billeted on the Mount of Olives. The road from Jericho goes through particularly desolate and wild country, and no doubt in years to come, many a civil service rifleman, when questioned by his offspring concerning the man who fell among thieves, will truthfully say, if you had seen the road you would not be surprised. It was not a habit in those days to keep us idle, and we were soon moved on up the Jerusalem-Nablus road via Bayer and Ram Allah to the Wadi el-Jib, where we temporarily relieved the 10th Irish Division. The battalion was in reserve, and bivouacked on a terraced hillside which was covered with fig trees and vines. It was very hot, and we were glad to resume our summer kit. The camping ground was one of the most pleasant we had experienced in Palestine, and we made the most of it. There were flowers and plants in great profusion, and botanists amongst us spent hours collecting specimens. One of them, a botanist by profession, collected 100 or so specimens which he had never seen before and which he could not name. Of actual war, we saw but little. Occasional bombing raids were made by enemy planes, but our chief enemy was just behind us, a gunner officer in charge of an 18-pounder battery, whose idea of humor was to give an order for 10 rounds gun fire regularly each night at varying times between midnight and 4 a.m. Our considered opinion of this gentleman cannot be published here. A week later, we moved back as far as Atara, where we gave a most sincere and regretful Godspeed to our colonel, who left us to take command of the 213th Battalion London Regiment. Colonel Bisty had joined us at El-Shalth in September 1917, 338, and no commanding officer was ever so popular, both with his officers and men. He had instilled into the regiment a magnificent spirit, and it is no idle boast to say that the regiment would have gone into action anywhere and under any circumstances with Colonel Bisty, with no misgivings and fully aware that, whatever happened, he would be their leader. Photo by Cyril, S.W. Lt. Col. T.E. Bisty DSO MC DCLI. Commanded 2nd Battalion, 9th October 1917 to May 1918. To face page 338. Chapter 38. Elhad Ain Eric Surafend Kantara Alexandria, Journey to Italy. On the 23rd of April, 1918, the battalion marched south from Atara and encamped for the night just north of Ram Allah, near Lake Balua. The march was carried out during the evening, and the bright weather made it enjoyable. On the 2 following days, the journey was continued towards Jerusalem, and on the night of the 25th we halted at Shafat, a few miles north of the city. Rumors of another stunt across the Jordan were then confirmed, and on the night of the 27th, the battalion marched down the Jericho road once more to Talat ed Dum, arriving there about 11 p.m., where the concentration of transport foreboded another operation on a large scale. The following evening, the battalion moved to the Jordan Valley and crossed over the river at Goranier Ford, which was then held by Indian troops. Although it was only April, the heat in the valley was terrific during the day, and white troops would, no doubt, have suffered considerable losses from disease had they been stationed there for any considerable length of time. The next day was spent amid the thick brushwood on the plain, and every available piece of shade was used. But even under this protection, the damp heat was nigh unbearable, and only a minimum of clothing in the shape of drill shorts were worn by most. There was a large concentration of troops in the area, and preparations were made for an attack on the foothills of the Moab Mountains. On the 30th, the attack was launched by the 179th Brigade, the Westminsters on the left and the London Scottish on the right, while the 180th Brigade was operating farther south. Under a heavy artillery bombardment, the troops advanced from their positions of deployment, which they had taken up during the night. They attacked the first ridge, and after heavy fighting, obtained a footing. Many prisoners were captured, and casualties were inflicted on the enemy. The 215th were held in reserve at Goranier Ford, and when a crowd of over 200 prisoners appeared, we felt that the operation was so successful that we should not be needed. It transpired afterwards, however, that these Turks were not captured in the actual 340 assault, but had been detailed to reconnoiter our concentration on the plain, and while coming over had walked into the London Scottish, who were pushing forward for the attack. They made no resistance, and were soon sent to the rear as prisoners. After the first ridge had been taken, it was found that the whole position was strongly held by the Turk, and that further advance over deep ravines swept by machine guns would be very difficult. Repeated attempts were made to push forward, but only heavy casualties resulted. The actual objective of the 179th Brigade was a steep hill called El Had, which lay some 6 miles east of the Jordan, and formed part of a continuous line of steep, rocky hills that bordered the Jericho Plain on the east. On the night of the 30th April, the London Scottish had only been able to gain the first ridge of El Had after heavy fighting, and during the following day, held on to the captured ground, with the idea of pressing forward the attack at dawn next morning. In order to support this second effort, A and B companies of the 215th pushed forward to the foot of El Had to act as local supports. The second attack on the 1st of May was also unsuccessful, not only at this one particular spot, but along the whole divisional front. Heavy machine gun fire swept each ridge, both from the front and the flanks, so cunningly had the Turk arranged his emplacements. Throughout the day desultory fighting took place and small local attacks were made, but no general advance could be accomplished. During the evening of the 1st of May, C and D companies were brought up from the Wadi Nimrin, where they had been moved the previous night, and during the night of the 1st, the battalion relieved the London Scottish on El Had. Orders were received on the same night to attack at dawn. This meant a busy night in reconnoitering. A and B companies were detailed for the attack, with C Company in support, and just before dawn, they deployed for the attack on the right flank of the hill, from which point it appeared the approach to the summit was easiest. D Company remained in possession of the captured ridge. The attack was launched forward with great spirit and dash, but was met with the same murderous fire that had swept down the London Scottish in their attempts, and the 215th could only push forward a little way, gaining some 500 yards and a small hill, thus forming for themselves an unpleasant little salient into the enemy's lines. Even then casualties were fairly heavy, and the work of carrying back the wounded was made more hazardous by the Turk, who fired on every stretcher with his machine guns throughout the day. Captain Peatfield, A Company, was reported missing, but late at night he returned under cover of darkness, having lain out all day in the sun, a few yards from a Turkish machine gun, apparently dead. At dusk the wounded were collected, and A and B were withdrawn, C Company staying on the captured ground and hastily organizing it for defense by building sangars. During the afternoon 2 platoons of D Company, under Lieutenant K. P. Neal, had attempted to push forward from the main ridge, but the progress was soon arrested by heavy machine gun fire, and this proved conclusively that frontal attacks were impossible. From the result of this local attack, it was learnt that between ourselves and the Turk was a deep ravine with precipitous banks. The night of the 3rd of May was fairly quiet except for the intermittent machine gun and rifle fire from both sides. On the following morning, however, the Turk made a determined counter-attack on our immediate right, against the London Irish of the 180th Brigade. Curiously, just before this counterattack took place, 4 enemy planes flew over our lines and poured machine gun fire down at us. They did little actual damage, and one of them was brought down by our Lewis gun fire. Everyone was on the alert for a repetition of the aeroplane attack and sought cover behind the numerous boulders on the hill. However, the planes sailed out of sight behind the summit of El Had, and just as everyone thought of coming from their cover, a sentry group in front of the battalion on our right shouted, "They're coming over," at which everyone nearby took immediate cover, but were soon surprised to find that no aeroplanes appeared, but that a force of Turks about 250 strong rushed their position and drove them off. The Turkish coup, however, was short-lived, and an immediate counter-attack by the Irish sent them hurrying back to their lines with loss. However, the incident was disastrous to that company of the 215th, which was holding the little salient which had been gained during the morning attack of the previous day, as the Turk was able to pour machine gun fire into the rear of C Company, causing casualties. The gallant action of Private Freer, a signaller, in remaining at his telephone though severely wounded and under close-range rifle fire, materially assisted the Irish to regain their position, for Captain Wills, of C Company, was thus able to send back information which led to the Irish receiving adequate support from our machine guns and 18-pounders. Later in the day, the enemy aeroplanes returned, but this time devoted their attentions to the transport lines and ASC dumps near Gorinier Ford. For the rest of the day, the infantry could make no progress, and spent their time watching the artillery bombardment of those places where machine guns had been located. The Turk was clever in concealing his emplacements, and it was only in the evening when a slight breeze sprang up were we able to detect one that had been firing at us 342 throughout the whole day. This machine gun was in a cave in the hillside, and the entrance to the cave had been cleverly camouflaged with a blanket of the same color as the surrounding rocks, and not until the breeze caused the blanket to move was it realized that the fire had been coming from an apparently solid rock. However, attentions were soon upon this spot, and one of our machine guns poured heavy fire into the cave, tearing the blanket in shreds, and no doubt killing the enemy gunners. On the evening of the 4th, May orders were received that the whole of the British force would be withdrawn to the Gorinier bridgehead, as the Turks had sent a considerable force down the Jordan Valley from the north, and which had been driven back by our cavalry that afternoon. However, it was realized that should this attack by the Turks succeed, our left flank and our line of retreat would both be seriously threatened. In the battalion, arrangements were made for D Company to be left as a rearguard, holding the hill of El Had until the rest of the battalion had got a good start across the plain. D Company kept up an occasional Lewis gun and rifle fire for nearly an hour, and then left the hill to the mercy of the Turks. Everyone was relieved to reach the wire entanglements of the Gorinier defenses, the gaps in which were guarded by Indian cavalry. The amusing part, however, was that when the battalion returned to its bivouac area of a few days previous, they found D Company there first. Apparently being a smaller force, they were more mobile, and certainly they knew the shortest cut home. Once inside the wire, a few hours' rest was granted, and at 3 a.m., the withdrawal was resumed as far as Tel El Sultan, a ruined village near Jericho. We arrived at our bivouac area early in the morning, and in the glorious warmth of the day, everyone enjoyed a thorough rest after the unsatisfactory hard fighting of the past few days. Before leaving the subject of El Had, a word of praise is due to the Divisional RAMC for the splendid manner in which they evacuated the wounded during the fighting, and had erected a large field hospital tent well within range of shell fire under the slopes of El Had. On the 6th of May, the battalion had the surprise of its life, when orders were received to pack up and move to Jericho, where motor lorries were to take us as far back as Jerusalem. Never in its existence had the battalion partaken of such luxury, but it is regretted that we all thought that this kindness to tired troops was to move them to another part of the front, where they were needed in a hurry. In the late hours of the afternoon, the battalion boarded the lorries, and the convoy started its journey to Jerusalem, along the new Jericho Road, which is a masterpiece in mountain roads, 343, and was built under German influence. About halfway home, we met several regiments of Indian cavalry proceeding in the direction of the Jordan Valley, where they were to hold the line during the summer months. Many of them wore the Mons Star ribbon, and apparently had seen fighting in France. After passing, these troops' rain commenced to fall, and those who had greedily sought the seats beside the driver paid the penalty and were soon drenched through. The lorries pulled up just north of Jerusalem on the Nablus Road, from which point each load of men marched independently to the camping ground near Shaphat, which we had occupied only a week previously. The writer was detailed to supervise the unloading of the battalion, and when they had finally debussed, he made his way to Shaphat probably about 45 minutes after the first party of the 215th had left their lorry. In spite of the rain and the muddy ground, bivouacs had been erected, and each one had a small candle burning inside. To see the camp from the roadway, it would have appeared to a casual observer that it had been in existence for several weeks. So expert had the battalion become in erecting its temporary home. Finding his bivouac, the writer was soon presented with a plate of bread, bully beef, pickles, cheese, and a mug of tea by his batman. On the 7th, the GOC division inspected the battalion and complimented it on the splendid way in which it had stuck to its unsuccessful work in the recent visit across the Jordan. The following day, the battalion moved north a few miles as far as Ram Allah. The march was not long, the road was fair, and the weather was glorious, and by 2 p.m. the battalion had settled down in its new area, and dinners were being cooked. I have already referred to the speed with which the battalion made themselves at home on the night we arrived at Shaphat, but as a further illustration, the following true story may be given. On this day's march we were followed by the London Scottish, who were in turn followed by an officer of our own battalion and a draft fresh from England who were on their way to join us. Having missed the battalion as it left Shaphat, this new officer attempted to catch us up. We arrived at our bivouac area and moved off the road to allow the Scottish to pass to their camp, which was farther north. We immediately put up our bivouacs and commenced cooking. The new officer and his men followed the Scottish for some 2 miles, only to find that the encampment he had passed some 25 minutes before was really that of his own battalion. It was hard to make him realize that we were only just ahead of the Scottish on the march, and turning off the road had immediately set to and erected our camp. Here news of a long rest reached us, and we were told that after the next day's march to Ain Eric, we should have a complete 344 rest. On the way to Ain Eric, we were inspected by the Commander-in-Chief, General Allenby, and on the afternoon of the 9th arrived at our new camp. The camp was situated on the rocky slopes of a deep wadi. Little ledges were however found for bivvies, and each company made itself at home in its particular area. The slopes were covered with many small trees, and it was undoubtedly one of the prettiest spots in Palestine that we had visited. Here the battalion remained for 10 days, and everything was done to make the rest enjoyable. At the top of the wadi near the main roadway, a few level places were found and football competitions, both inter-battalion and inter-company, were arranged. A brigade sports committee was set up and a varied program of games, sports and transport competitions was arranged. The final placings were as follows: 215th Battalion, 10 points, 214th Battalion, 10 points, 216th Battalion, 3 points, and 213th Battalion, 3 points. Great credit was due to the excellent turn out of our transport section, and also our Lewis gunners in their particular competitions. In the brigade football final, the London Scottish beat the Queen's Westminsters after a hard game. The divisional concert party arrived and gave nightly performances in a large marquee. In the battalion itself, company concerts were held, a piano being hired all the way from Jerusalem through the personal efforts of Lieutenant Phelps. The whist drive held by B Company must also be included in the mention in dispatches. Shooting competitions were held at a small range built at the bed of the wadi, and battalion sports, limited to the three-legged, sack, egg and spoon type of race, were held on the flat bed of the wadi and proved a huge success. There was no suitable ground for sprinting, and even the course for the comic races had to be cleared of large stones by a voluntary fatigue party. One competition of the afternoon which deserves special mention was a beauty competition for the best-dressed lady. The originality of the aspirants was marvelous, and real harem dresses with the aid of bacon wrappings, etc., were among the prize winners. Canteen stores were plentiful, and dinner parties were given throughout the camp each night. A real happy time was spent here, and the battalion was loath to leave Ain Eric when orders were issued on the night of the 19th May. The battalion proceeded next morning to Beit Elo by a circuitous route around the many hills in that part of Palestine. A pleasant camping ground was found, and after a night's rest we proceeded the next morning to Beit Rima, which was near the center of the British line in Palestine, which then extended from Jaffa, on the west, to a point just south of Nablus on the east. Here the proximity of the enemy's observation posts necessitated us to place our bivouacs under the numerous olive 345 trees on the terraces round the village. For the next week or so, the battalion rested by day, and each night large working parties sallied forth north of the village of Beit Rima to dig a system of trenches for the defense of the hill. Rumors of France commenced to float about, and these rumors soon developed into fact. On the 29th of May, 1918, the battalion, together with the London, Scottish, and Queen's Westminsters of the same brigade, bade farewell to the 60th Division. In France, heavy fighting and the stupendous thrust by the Germans in the spring of 1918 necessitated that seasoned troops from the east should proceed to the Western Front. Certain battalions of the 60th Division were therefore withdrawn from the Palestine Front, leaving on an average one white battalion in each brigade, and filling up their vacancies with Indian troops. Leaving Beit Rima, the battalion trekked to the Jaffa area via Ibn Harith, Amwaz, near Latran, to Surafend, near Lud, which had then become the British railhead for the western flank of the British line in Palestine. The marches were carried out by night as the summer heat became too trying for any movement by day. The nights were warm and glorious, a bright moon shone throughout the march, the roads were in good condition, and everyone enjoyed the journey. Only one night was spent at Surafend, and in the afternoon of the 2nd of June, the battalion marched to Lud Station and traveled throughout the night, reaching Kantara by 5 a.m. on the 3rd. A short march to the rest camp brought the journey to an end, and here we were met by the advance party under Lieutenant Neal, who allotted us to our proper lines in the camp. At Kantara, we were fortunate to be given a part of the divisional rest camp and were not bothered to erect tents, as was the lot of other battalions in the division. The camp kitchens, canteens, and mess tents were at our disposal, and this saved a great deal of work and organization. Immediately on our arrival, large parties were granted leave to Cairo and Alexandria, and except for morning parades and ordinary camp duties, those who remained took every advantage of the benefits of life in a base camp. The local cinema huts, concert party marquees, and canteens were packed each night, and every-day bathing parades in the Suez Canal were held. The weather was extremely hot, and the bathing parades were a great boon. Preparations were also made for an early departure to France. On the evening of the 15th of June, 1918, the battalion paraded and marched to Kantara Station and entrained for Alexandria, which place was reached by 5 a.m. the following morning. The train ran alongside our transport, the Indera. As soon as the train stopped on the quayside, we were busy 346 transferring our stores, and for a couple of hours, fatigue parties were constantly up and down the gangways. When this work was completed, the battalion paraded alongside the boat and then marched up the gangway, leaving their pith helmets in heaps on the dock side. It was a pathetic farewell to Egypt, where we had thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. The Indera remained alongside for the day, but no leave ashore was granted, and the time was spent in allotting boat stations and issuing life belts. The following morning we moved to the middle of the harbor, and during the day bathing from the side of the boat was permitted, and although a certain amount of flotsam floated around the ship, the warm sea water was most delightful. Non-swimmers were advised to put on their life belts in order to gain confidence in case the journey was ill-fated, and in many cases, the men proved to themselves the efficiency of the belts in actual water. Practice alarms for boat stations added to the pleasure of the day. About midday, the Indera was joined by 4 other transports, namely, the Kaiserai Hind, Malwa, Caledonia, and Canberra. This convoy left the harbor in the evening in single file and was escorted by armed trawlers and some naval vessels, to one of which was attached a captive balloon for purposes of detecting submarines, which frequented the area around the entrance to Alexandria Harbor. Several aeroplanes also flew over the convoy, and not until we were some 50 miles out to sea did our aerial escort leave us, when we were handed over to the care of 10 Japanese destroyers, and then the trawlers from Alexandria returned. By the time the Alexandrian escort had left us, the transports had lined up abreast of each other with a distance of roughly 500 yards between each boat, and this formation was retained throughout the voyage, the 10 Japanese destroyers forming advanced, rear, and flank guards. The journey across the Mediterranean was without incident, and the coast of Italy came into view early on the morning of the 21st of June, and the convoy steamed towards Taranto harbor. When the boats arrived within the wide bay just outside the entrance to the inner harbor, everyone was relieved. But excitement was intense when the guns of the escort opened rapid fire on our left. Immediately, the Japanese flag was run up the mast of each of the destroyers, and frantic signals were sent from the commander's boat, which was ahead of the flotilla. 3 of the destroyers rushed at full speed to a spot about 2 miles to the left of the convoy and immediately commenced to drop depth charges, the explosions of which shook the sides of the Indera even at that distance. Torpedoes, however, had already been fired by the enemy submarine, which had apparently 347 been lying in wait in the harbor only a couple of miles from an Italian naval base. One of these torpedoes came at a terrific speed, leaving a white wake in its trail, and passed in rear of the Malwa on our left, and only missed the bows of our own boat by a few yards. The second torpedo passed about 200 yards ahead of the convoy. The course of the transports was immediately altered, and with a zigzag route the boats hurried to their berths just outside the narrow entrance of the inner harbor, while the Japanese destroyers continued to drop depth charges around the suspected position of the German submarine. No official result was published, but it was reported in Taranto that the submarine was sunk by the explosion of the depth charges. The following day, the Indera moved through the narrow channel into the inner harbor. So narrow is this entrance that the sides of our troopship only missed the high walls on both sides by a matter of 5 or 6 yards. In the inner harbor were battleships of all sizes belonging to the Italian Navy, and one marveled how our allies could allow enemy submarines to lie in wait just outside without any interference. For on our arrival not a sign of an Italian warship was seen in the outer harbor. In the peacefulness of the still waters of the inner harbor, which was several square miles in area, we remained until the early hours of the following morning, and just after dawn the battalion disembarked by means of lighters, which carried us to the temporary pier, erected on the shallow beach near the British base camp. It was the 23rd of June, 1918. Just a year previously we had landed in Egypt, and 2 years practically to the day since we had left England for France. Once again our feet were on the continent of Europe, and we felt we had left the East for good. We looked forward with no little anxiety to our coming return to France, though many maintained that we were bound for the Italian Trentino front, and arriving at Taranto and not Marseille lent color to this possibility. Chapter 39. Journey through Italy and France, Reconstruction Mole Saint-Sylvestre-Capelle, Mont-Rouge-Locher, Dranouter Mont-Videgny. On arrival at the pier at Taranto Beach, a short march brought us to our lines in the base camp. Only 1 day was spent here, and the following evening we entrained for France. During the day canteen, stores were bought for the journey from the large expeditionary force canteen, but no leave into the town was granted. Orders were issued for entraining that evening, and an amusing paragraph appeared to the effect that troops were requested not to refer to our gallant allies, the Italians, as Italianos, ice creamos, chip potatoes, etc. The route by train was along the east coast of Italy, and the train left the camp sighting about 8 p.m. on the evening of the 24th June, 1918. The first part of the journey was practically along the seashore, and there was nothing of special note about the scenery. Halts were made at Bari, Foggia, Termoli, and Castellammare, which town was reached about 1 p.m. on the 25th. By the following midday, we had reached Rimini, having passed through Ancona and Pesaro en route. As far as Rimini, the scenery had not been above the average of the coastal scenery of Kent or Sussex, but shortly after leaving the town, the railroad branched inland towards Faenza, and on this part of the journey, the scenery was beautiful, the countryside being rich with summer flowers of bright colors, while the perfect blue of the sky overhead added to the richness of the color scheme. Faenza was reached by 4 p.m. on the 25th June, and a long halt was made in a siding, and men were permitted to leave the train and stretch their legs a little. Hitherto the halts had been short, and just long enough to permit the issue of hot tea, which had been prepared at wayside cookhouses previous to our arrival. At Faenza, the long halt of several hours permitted officers to visit the town, where a decent meal was procured at one of the hotels. Time also enabled many of us to purchase and send home as souvenirs pieces of artistic pottery, for which the town is noted. Early in the evening, the journey was resumed, and our next halt was made in 349, the large station of Bologna, just after 8 p.m., when we caught a passing glimpse of the quaint cathedral and university in the town. The people on the station cheered us as the train pulled up, a decided change from the apathetic gaze which had been our greeting from the southern Italians. While standing in the station, a long ambulance train full of wounded Italian troops drew up alongside our train and fraternizing between the two armies commenced. Cigarettes and souvenirs were exchanged, and when the hospital train moved out, we gave a hearty cheer to our wounded allies. A short time afterwards our train steamed out of Bologna, and by dawn the following morning, we were passing through the glorious mountain scenery of northern Italy. The train wended its way along deep valleys and pierced through the long tunnels which are numerous in the Apennines. The route taken was through Novi Ligure, Ronco to Sampierdarena, just west of Genoa, the railway skirting the city at this part of the journey. During the afternoon of the 27th, we halted at Savona, where an enthusiastic crowd gathered and cheered us, no doubt thinking that the battalion was part of the British forces, which had so materially assisted the Italians in their recent victories on the Trentino front. We did not disillusion these kind people, and accepted their flowers, fruits, and cigarettes. From Savona the journey was continued along the seashore, and we enjoyed the beauty of the calm, blue, sunlit Mediterranean on our left, and on the other hand the steep cliffs covered with bright flowers and dotted here and there with pretty little towns and beautiful gardens. At 11 p.m. that night the train pulled up at Ventimiglia, the frontier station, where certain international formalities were gone through by the railway officials. However, such things did not worry us, and we spent the halt in the railway refreshment cafes and buffets. Unfortunately, the beauties of the Mentoncans Riviera were passed at night time, and the only excitement of the night was the gamble in most carriages while we were passing Monte Carlo. Early on the morning of the 28th June, we reached the outskirts of Marseille. The railway ran along the northeastern side of the town on high ground, and a splendid view of the harbor and city was obtained. From this point the route went northwards via Muramas, Avignon, where we crossed the Rhone to La Tille, which town we reached at 10 p.m. that night, and obtained an excellent meal at the railway buffet. The rest of the beauty of the Rhone Valley, which many of us had enjoyed some 18 months previously, was lost in the darkness. Lyon was passed early the next morning, but it was sufficiently light to obtain a splendid view of the city and its bridges, which had been denied us in the outward journey to the east. After passing through Saint-Germain's, Aumont d'Or the 350 railway branched off to the west, and a long halt was made at Paris-le-Monial, giving us the opportunity of exploring the quaint provincial French town for about an hour, when the journey was again resumed. During the night we passed through Moulins, Nevers, and Jean, and on this part of the trip we passed a train containing the London Scottish, which had been delayed owing to a fire breaking out in one of the trucks. During the morning of the 30th June, we arrived near Versailles about 10 a.m., at which point the network of railways is extremely intricate and hopes of passing through Paris were high at one moment when we appeared to be traveling towards the capital, only to be dashed to the ground the next, when the train shot over the points in quite a different direction. Over this network of railway lines outside Versailles the train halted, shunted, went forward, moved backwards until we became quite bewildered as to the real direction of Paris. But when we eventually passed through the station of Poissy, it was settled once, and for all that we were not going near Paris. The day was beautifully warm, and everyone was getting tired of this long train journey with its constant jolting, when the train pulled up miles from nowhere. Everyone descended from the train to the fields alongside and enjoyed a leg stretch. The signal was against us, and in spite of the frantic whistle of the engine, it did not fall. None of the railway officials could account for the stoppage, so we enjoyed the freedom of the fields for about 2 hours. Eventually, however, the shrill whistle of the engine warned us that the journey was to be continued, and as the train slowly moved, everyone made a dash for their truck. Everyone was present except 2 officers, and we all worried about their apparent predicament, or even perhaps their desertion. However, about a mile further up the line the train pulled up and the 2 truants appeared. Apparently they had gone off to a village further up the line in search of luxuries in the shape of eggs, butter, fruit, etc. And before leaving had made a compact with the driver, no doubt with the aid of a few francs, to wait for them at a given point if the train was permitted to pass the signal. After this incident, the train crawled along until the town of Geysers was reached, and here the explanation of our delay was apparent. The train in front of ours, carrying French troops and transport, had run into a stationary engine in the station, and as the result of the collision, several carriages had been smashed up and the engine derailed, causing casualties among both troops and horses. After some delay, which allowed us to visit the cafes in the town near the station, we proceeded on our journey, and early on the 1st of July, we passed through Étaples, where the large British cemetery brought back to us the real horrors of war after a pleasant journey. Across the Mediterranean and the long 351 an interesting train ride through Italy and France. From Etaples, the journey to Boulogne was through a particularly dull piece of country, and consisted of a continuous line of dumps, hospitals, camps, hutments, ordnance depots, etc. About midday on the 1st of July, 1918, the battalion detrained at Audrix, a large Royal Engineer locomotive repair depot. The scenery at this place was not particularly pleasing. All railheads are surrounded by the same old ration and ammunition dumps, but the WAAC, whom we had never seen before, brightened our lives at that particular moment. It must be remembered that we had not seen a real fresh-complexioned English girl for over 2 years. Not that I am belittling the beauty of their French sisters, or even the particular charms of the girls of Italy, Macedonia, Egypt, and Palestine, but to us, there were none to touch the homely loveliness of the British girl. Orders were soon issued by the new divisional staff which had met us on our arrival, and we proceeded to billets at Mole, not an excessive distance. It is true, neither were the roads dusty and rough like the tracks we had traversed out east, but after a week in the train it was a trying march. Here we were informed that we were to form part of the 30th Division, which had been recently reconstructed, and was under the command of Major General W. de Williams, CMG, DSO, and with the London Scottish and the Queen's Westminsters, we were to form the 90th Infantry Brigade under Brigadier General G. A. Stevens, DSO. The other 2 brigades in the division were the 21st Brigade, consisting of the 16th Cheshire Regiment, 223rd London Regiment, and the 7th Royal Irish Regiment, and the 89th Brigade, containing the 2nd Battalion South Lancashire Regiment, 78th Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and the 217th London Regiment. The following extract from a brief history of the 30th Division gives an idea of the state of affairs on our joining the division. The various units of the division were collected together at the beginning of July, occupying an area around Castle, where divisional headquarters were. But the division was hardly ready to go into the line without some training and preparation. This was particularly the case since there were indications that the enemy was going to attack again on the Kemmel-Hazebrouck front. The French troops holding the line between Kemmel and the Mont des Cats had been relieved by British troops at the beginning of the month, and the defensive systems still required a good deal of attention, so that during the month of July the division was busy enough. The various battalions within the 3 brigades of the division had to get to know each other. The various arms of the division had to learn to work together for defense and offense. The 352 Palestine battalions had to accustom themselves to the warfare of 1918, which had changed since their departure for Salonika in 1916, while the whole division had to prepare for and practice its role as reserve division to the 10th Corps with a series of counterattack programs in the event of an enemy attack taking place. This involved careful organization and coordination of each arm for the various situations that might arise, from the piercing of the line by Mont Rouge to a thrust on the southwestern slopes of the Mont des Cats. From the 2nd of July to the 7th, the battalion was comfortably billeted at Mole and carried out intensive field training in the neighborhood. Our battalion organization was soon revised and completed, and the battalion was initiated into the revised methods of warfare in France in 1918. Leave was granted to the United Kingdom in limited numbers, it being in most cases the first home leave for 2 years. On the 7th of July, the battalion marched to La Nippe, between Saint-Omer and Castle, and stayed there for the night. The next morning the march was resumed as far as Yques, where the battalion was billeted in a couple of large farms between the villages of Saint-Sylvester-Capelle and Yques. The battalion, in common with the remainder of the division, became responsible for the defense of the reserve line at Coq de Pale, southwest of Mont des Cats. Each day reconnaissances of the various routes from our billets to the position, and also a complete study of the system itself, was made by officers and NCOs. On several occasions, the battalion marched up at night and manned the trenches for practice purposes, while schemes for counter-attacks from the trenches were worked out and practiced. During the day, field training was carried out with vigor, while on those evenings when we were not detailed to march up to the Coq de Pale defenses for the night, company concerts, assisted by our own drum and fife band, which had again been organized, were held. Except for the night time, when the enemy persisted in shelling a dump of artillery ammunition near our farms, Our stay at Ypres was quite enjoyable. Leave was still granted, and parties continued to leave each day for the United Kingdom. On the 13th of July, we were inspected by General Plumer, the army commander, who complimented us on our turn out, the usual splendid lot of men business which we all know. German attacks on our front were threatened to take place on the 18th of July in the region of Montrouge, and the battalion was accordingly ordered to move up through Beauchep and was held in reserve for the night in the rear of Montrouge, with orders to occupy and defend the line of reserve trenches covering Berthen-Should. The attack develop. However, beyond 353, the usual artillery fire the night was quiet, and we returned just after daybreak to our billets near Ypres. Training was continued for another week, and on the 25th the battalion moved up to the line near Montrouge and relieved the 17th Royal Scots in the support trenches on the Locher sector. Nothing of special interest occurred beyond the usual unpleasantness of trench warfare. Movement by day was practically impossible owing to the German observation from Mont Kemmel on our left front. For 5 days we remained in this sector of the line, and were relieved on the night of the 30th by the 214th London, Scottish, and marched back towards Beauchep. We had suffered a few casualties from shelling, but it was great experience for the officers and men who had joined the battalion since its departure from the French front in 1916. Those of us who remembered the old line at Neuville-Saint-Vaast were struck by the absence of those splendid dugouts which we had occupied during our first visit to France. On the 3rd of August, the battalion moved back as far as Saint-Sylvestre-Capelle and enjoyed a week's rest. At the end of the week, the battalion moved to the line and took over the Lochrihof subsector as supports, and were moved up 7 days later to the front-line trenches, relieving the London Scottish. Only 2 days were spent in the front line, when we were relieved by the Queen's Westminster Rifles and returned from the line to Moth Farm, which lay midway between Beauchep and Godwersvelde, and while in rest here it was arranged that our division should attack the Dranouter Ridge. We overlooked the German lines throughout their length from the Mont-Noirmont Rouge Ridge, but the Boche had the advantage in the possession of the Dranouter Ridge, a long spur running down from Montrouge through Locher, with Dranouter at its tip, which high ground represented, after successive ebbings and flowings, the mark of the Hun tide of advance there. This ridge, looking down as it did into our front trenches, made approach by day almost impossible, and it set bounds to movement, cooking and life there generally, which only those who had to live there could properly appreciate. The 35th Division, whom we had relieved, had long ago made up their minds to take the ridge, but wet weather set in and their patrols reported the going across, no man's land impossible. It was therefore left for us to accomplish. The attack was fixed for the night of the 21st-22nd of August. It entailed an advance of some 300 yards over swampy ground, pocked with shell holes, the crossing of the river Dover here a small stream, the ascent up through the straggling Wakefield and Mowbray woods to the crest, where stood 2 strongly 354 fortified posts, the old farms of Romp and Lochrihof. A total advance of about 1,000 yards. The going was really difficult in the last part, where to the usual tangle of rough grass, shell holes new and old, odds and ends of trenches and dugouts was added the presence of trees and some undergrowth, the navigation of which even in daylight, and without an enemy or the impedimento of attack, requires a certain care. The London Scottish represented the 90th Brigade in this show, and that the attack was carried out with courage and great credit is due to the 214th Londons, who showed that the Palestine troops were equal to any demands that the Western Front might make upon them. During the night following the attack, the Civil Service Rifles relieved the Scottish in the captured line, which merely consisted of odd shell holes, and there withstood a determined counterattack delivered by storm troops. Under continual heavy artillery, trench mortar, and machine gun fire, we helped to consolidate the new front line. Fighting patrols were pushed forward and great courage was displayed by members of the 215th, particularly Sergeant P. J. Kelly's patrol, C Company, at Lochrihof Farm, and by Lieutenant H. J. Mallett's patrol, D Company. Wakefield Wood, which was on our front, was heavily shelled with gas shells, but this did not deter the battalion, and on the 24th of August, we drove off a determined counterattack by the Boche. Local fighting continued until the 26th, but the consolidation of the line progressed, when the battalion was withdrawn and retired to the comparative security of the dugouts on Montrouge, and on the following day, returned to our old billet at Moth Farm for a couple of nights, when a return to Montrouge was made. On the 1st of September, the enemy withdrew from Mont Kemmel, and the British line was immediately pushed forward as far as Daylight Corner and close to Wolvergam. On the night of the 3rd-4th of September, we relieved the London Scottish near Wolvergam, which was merely indicated by a notice board with "This is Wolvergam," and a few chipped and broken tombstones which marked the site of the church. Our orders were to carry on the same policy of advancing as far as possible without a full-dress attack. But we were now up against the outposts of the enemy's main line of resistance. He held the high ground, and furthermore the ground was of the worst possible type for advance under fire. Hardly a yard of it but had been wired at some time in one direction or another. In fact, it looked exactly as if the wire had taken root and spread like brambles. What was not wire was shell holes or old trenches full, or perhaps only half full, of water. Any advance 355 at all was creditable. There was, too, from this time a noticeable increase in artillery fire of all calibers, with a fair amount of gas from our line back beyond Daylight Corner to beyond Kemmel. Wolvergam and Daylight Corner succeeded Locher and Canada Corner as targets, with Kemmel as a substitute for the Montrouge Hills. Thus, though the left company of the 215th Londons managed on the 4th to advance their right about 200 yards and establish new posts east of Wolvergam, efforts during the night of the 4th-5th yielded little in the way of progress, but more in the way of heroism when Private Cleaver stayed by his wounded comrade in no man's land until they were found 2 or 3 days later. But even as this bald outline suggests, there was plenty of work and opportunity for both leadership and initiative, whether on the part of the company commander, e.g., Captain Andrew, whose bold reconnaissances were of as great value to his company as to the battalion, or on the part of the platoon commanders, Sergeant E.G. Ward, B Company, who held on all day in an isolated position far ahead of the general line, or Private Shepherd, D Company, who specially distinguished himself by keeping up communication under fire between his own platoon, which was isolated in front, and his company. On the night of the 5th-6th, we were relieved by the Queen's Westminsters and marched back to Donegal Farm, at the foot of Mont Kemmel, leaving the 216th to carry on our work of peaceful penetration. After a couple of days' stay here, we marched back as far as Mont Videgny, where our rest consisted of furnishing strong working parties for road making and clearing up the area near Westouter. The battalion transport and quartermaster's stores moved up from Non-Ni Bosch, near Godwersvelde, which had been their home since the beginning of August, to a place just west of Westouter. Not only had this rear headquarters provided us with rations and letters regularly while we were in the line, but they had prepared for us a concert party, a revival of the original Plumes, who had worked hard and got together an excellent program under the able leadership of Lieutenant K.P. Neal, our assistant quartermaster. A full-dress rehearsal was given in a marquee on the 14th of September on the rear slopes of Mont Videgny. Other units of the brigade were invited and gave the party a great reception. One must remember that although the party did not reach the excellence of a London theatre, or even the Barnstormers, one of our Egyptian divisional concert parties, it was composed of men of the transport and quartermaster's staff who came up the line each night with rations and shared with the battalion the unpleasantness of enemy artillery fire and aerial bombing raids. It was not a party of selected entertainers who retired 356 from the fray for the sole purpose of becoming efficient music hall artists. On the 16th, the battalion was moved to Mont-Noir, and Major Bank assumed command. Working parties still continued to work in the Westouter area, while parties of officers were detailed to make a thorough reconnaissance of the line just beyond Wolvergam and facing Messens Ridge, with a view of relieving the 6th Cheshire Regiment. However, this work was in vain. Orders for the relief were cancelled, and we were ordered to move farther south and occupy the support area on the Neuve Eglise sector, taking over from the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. 16 LT, Call Gaze proceeding on leave. On the 19th of September, the battalion marched from Mont Videgny over the captured area as far as Bailleul, which town was now completely devastated, and then turning east arrived at Neuve Eglise about midnight. The relief was carried out successfully, although everyone was tired after their march of some 10 or 11 miles. Chapter 40. Neuve Eglise, Messens Houtham Wycheat. In the Neuve Eglise area, the companies were spread over a considerable area, the whole of which was under the direct observation from the German lines on Messens Ridge. A company was in immediate support to the London Scottish, who were in the line on Hill 63, north of Ploegsteert Wood, while the remaining 3 companies were dotted along the defensive line of trenches just east of the village of Neuve-Eglise. The battalion was under orders to garrison this reserve line should the Boche make an attack on our immediate front. Movement, of course, during daylight was restricted, and at the slightest sign of smoke, the enemy would deluge the area with shells, and during one of these strafes, B Company had to move its home further back, but not without suffering a few casualties. A and C Company were also unfortunate one night while furnishing working parties in the line, and several of their men were killed and wounded during an enemy bombardment of Hill 63. On the whole, however, a quiet time was spent in this area, and the battalion was ordered up the line on the 26th of September. We relieved the 67th in Niskellings and took over the line in front of Messens town from the right of the main road from Wolvergem to Messens. Headquarters was situated near South Midland Farm. A Company were in the front line on the sector adjoining the road, and C Company on their right, having Stinking Farm as their right flank. B Company provided supports to both front companies, while D Company were held in reserve behind South Midland Farm. The intention was that within a few days the battalion, in conjunction with other units, should attack and capture Messens Ridge, so that the first days in the line were spent in reconnoitering our front, from which it was learnt that the enemy had a plentiful supply of machine guns. At night time, we were also busy in bringing up and distributing stores which are peculiar to an organized attack, such as red lights, very pistols, and so forth. To recapture the ridge was less an operation by itself than an operation supplementary to a much larger attack further north. The 216th Queen's Westminsters were on our right, and the 217th Londons on our left. The main road from Wolvergem to Messens formed the general line of the direction of our attack. On the divisional front, the first objectives were some enemy strong points close to our front line, and directly in front of our battalion were 3 such strongholds, viz. Big Bull Cottage, Boyle's Farm, and Rome Alley. The attack was timed for dawn on the 28th, and at 5 a.m. our artillery opened up their bombardment on our front. It was not a creeping barrage, which had by that time become fairly perfect, but was rather a treatment of carefully selected places and areas to cover the advance of our companies on their allotted strong points to be attacked. Both our attacking companies got well off the mark under this artillery preparation and possessed themselves of their objectives, the greatest resistance coming from Big Bull Cottage, where most of the occupants were killed, and before 7 a.m. the battalion had claimed 17 prisoners and 9 machine guns. The battalion on our left were also successful in capturing Mortar Farm and Ontario Farm. This clearing of the way for the advance to the Messens Ridge, though perhaps more an affair of fighting patrols than a staged attack, called for a good deal of initiative on the part of company, platoon, and subordinate commanders in rushing and getting around machine guns, when even the mere covering of the ground alone presented considerable difficulties. All the enemy strong points to be attacked had the armaments of machine guns, Captain Peatfield's company. A, our left attacking company, accounting for 6, Second Lieutenant Pittam leading the platoon that captured them. Lance Sergeant P. Mason, of A Company, mopped up a post of 4 with no little dash and skill, helped by the daring reconnaissances of the previous night, in which Private J. Valk had a notable share. C Company Captain F. H. Duhome had also pushed forward and captured a network of trenches known as Rome Alley, driving off the garrison and killing a few of the enemy, while their patrols afterwards pushed towards Gabion Farm, which was strongly held by the enemy. Against this strong point, C Company had to form a defensive flank, as the 216th Battalion had not advanced in the first stage of the day's operations. No determined counterattack was made on our front, although the enemy was active with his snipers and machine guns. B Company moved forward during the attack from their position in support and occupied our original front line, while D Company was brought up to occupy the support line vacated by B Company. The new front was then held pending the result of the greater 359 attack taking place further north, while on our right the 216th Battalion, Queen's Westminsters, assisted during the afternoon on the left flank of the attack of the 31st Division through Ploegsteert Wood, which met with considerable resistance, and the Westminsters suffered considerable casualties. The actual attack took place about 3 p.m. in the afternoon of the 28th and turned out to be no easy task. The element of surprise which had assisted us was of course entirely lacking, and the progress of the troops on our right was attended with difficulties, and the Boche made a determined stand, but under pressure gradually gave way. By this time, the success of the operations further north had begun to tell, and pressed on his right flank as well as in front, the enemy began to withdraw over the ridge in the late afternoon. His passage over the ridge, which of course was visible, was hastened by our artillery and machine gun fire, which the sight of the enemy on the run in broad daylight naturally provoked. More than that, the division could now, while still preserving the role of flanking the attack further north, push on to the ridge. Orders were accordingly issued for further patrols to advance over the ridge in the evening and secure a line east of Messens itself, curving back on the right to keep in touch with the troops there. This implied following the dip into the hollow of the Steenbeck River and its steepish rise to the top of the ridge, the whole way a pitted and torn desolation of the familiar type. Progress in the dark, it was pitch dark that night, was necessarily slow over such ground. During the late afternoon and the evening, our advance companies pushed forward, meeting small resistance from the enemy's rearguards. A company on the left were able to push forward past Hospice Mill and actually entered the ruined village of Messens before midnight. The advance of C Company was necessarily slower as the troops on our right were held up, and it became necessary for us to form a defensive flank. Unfortunately, it was found inadvisable to hold the village of Messens, as the battalion on our left had also met some strong resistance, and the salient which we formed became particularly unpleasant, and it was ordered that we should withdraw from the village itself and occupy Hospice Mill, on the western outskirts, where B Company had pushed out in support of A Company during the advance to the village. In view of the advance being continued the following day, it was decided that D Company should relieve A Company in the front line, and B Company should continue as supports and A and C Companies be held in battalion reserve. Great credit is due to all concerned for the excellent manner in which this reorganization was carried out on such a dark night, and over 360 strange country covered with shell holes, trenches, and with entanglements. The first day's work had been very successful. Our casualties were comparatively small when one realizes the advance we had made, and most of them were the result of heavy artillery fire which had continued all day on our old front line, and curious as it may seem, headquarters suffered most, one unlucky shell killing 9 and wounding 5 others seriously. Amongst those killed by this shell was our RSM H.W. Lovelock, well known to both the 1st and 2nd Battalions. By daylight on the 29th, however, the ridge was ours for the taking, and in the heavy mist at dawn parties of the battalion pushed forward and by 7 o'clock were in the village and over the ridge. Messens, with its memories of 4 years fighting, passed into British hands again, and this time for good. There was indeed little else than memories, save the jagged cairn which had been the church, the ruined houses which had been made into concrete blockhouses, some of them left intact, or nearly so, and a few broken tombstones on the site of the cemetery. The Messens Ridge in the chill of a misty, late September morning, when you have been fighting since dawn the day before, and do not know where in the mist the enemy is hidden, provides neither time nor the place for philosophizing. The ridge, from being an objective, became merely a road to the Valley of the Lies. Somewhere there, as not infrequently in the history of Flanders, we might expect a stand to be made. The task of the division was to see that it was made as far east of the ridge as possible, at any rate, as far as the line of the Yper Commons Canal, so well known and so little loved in the salient farther north. In order to carry out this idea, the battalion was ordered to push forward at dawn and advance as far as Houtham, and if possible make for the line of the canal, a distance of over 3 miles. Except for constant artillery fire, the first mile of the advance on our actual front was carried out with few losses to ourselves. However, we soon came under the direct observation of the captive balloons behind the German lines, and his artillery fire became heavier and well directed. As no other British troops were to be seen over the ridge, it was decided to halt about 2 p.m., and while waiting for further developments, we had the pleasure of seeing one of our airmen bring down 2 of the enemy balloons in flames. They were immediately replaced by another balloon, but its life was short and the airman returned and downed it. An enemy plane, flying low, came over our position, but luckily no artillery fire resulted. Just after 2 p.m. we saw a British skirmishing line advance on our left, and patrols soon got in touch, to find that it was the 3612th Battalion of the South Lancashires, of the 89th Brigade, who had pushed through the 217th Londons and taken up the pursuit. After consultation between the 2 battalion commanders, it was decided to push on together towards Houtham Church, as the 2nd South Lancashires were in touch with a battalion of the 41st Division on their left. On our right matters were not so clear, and the heavy machine gun fire confirmed our idea that the Boche was making a stand. The first part of our advance from Messines was over ground which had been in our hands the previous winter, while the latter half was enemy territory and unknown to us. The going down the slope was easier than on the west side of the ridge, though still a desolation of rank grass and old shell holes. Houses, of course, there were none. Remnants of trenches and wire entanglements still served to remind us of the former British frontline area. The only solid things were the pillboxes left vacant, and in many cases intact, by the retreating enemy. By our rapid advance, we were able to materially assist the advance of the 41st Division on our left by outflanking the enemy machine gunners. On our right, the advance had been taken up by the London Scottish, and during the night of the 29th of September, they entered Warneton. After we had linked up with the South Lancashires, we were able to push forward without meeting much opposition, and lost only a few men wounded. When darkness came, we had reached the Ypres Commons Canal, and took up a defensive line near the canal near Houtham, turning our right flank to face south, as we had not at that time obtained touch with our troops on the right. We used the numerous pillboxes as rain began to fall, and except for intermittent artillery fire and an occasional burst of machine gun fire which caused us a few casualties, the night was quiet. Signal communication by lamp was obtained with brigade headquarters on Messines Ridge. By dawn on the 30th of September, our right flank was secured by the Queen's Westminsters, who arrived during the night, and the brigade formed the extreme right of the great advance, which was proceeding successfully from the banks of the Lys to the north. The river Lys forming a protection to the retiring enemy made it necessary for a great deal of preliminary work to be done before any advance in that direction could be undertaken. Next day brought no further advance on our front. The 30th Division was flanking an attack rather than making one, and so regulated its movements to those of the forces on the left where the line went away northeast towards Gellu and onwards. We were free to close up the tail of the division behind Messines Ridge, to improve shelter where there was none, which was practically everywhere, to clear roads, and to count 362 the spoil. The number of prisoners taken was small, but if there is a peculiar pleasure in capturing guns which have shelled you for days and nights together, that pleasure was ours, for the division took 4 8-inch howitzers, 3 59-inch howitzers, 1 59-inch gun, 3 42-inch howitzers, and a similar number of guns, and 24 field guns. Anyone who cared might possess himself of a trench mortar or a machine gun with sufficient ammunition for a month's fighting. The whole battlefield was, in fact, strewn with material from trench boards to 15-inch duds, relics of the British bombardment the previous year. The only road for transport and guns was the Wolvergem-Messines Road. A very large crater completely demolishing it had been blown just east of the Steenbeck, where the road ran over an embankment. The enemy had also placed 36 tank mines across the road. These were all removed, and the crater bridged to take lorry traffic by midday on the 29th of September. On the morning of the 30th, the divisional front, which had been gradually lessened in width by the advance from the north of the 41st Division, and on the south by the 31st Division, was handed over to the reserve brigade, the 21st Brigade, and the battalion was withdrawn and marched back to Messines Ridge, and occupied old Hun dugouts and pillboxes near Blawn Mullen, where Colonel Gaze rejoined from leave. Our rest, however, was soon disturbed, and the area was heavily shelled, causing casualties, especially among the men of B Company, and after a short and unpleasant stay on this part of the ridge, the battalion moved to Oostavern Wood, a little farther north. The march proved exciting, as a Boche plane came over our lines and cleverly set fire to 5 of our observation balloons in such quick fashion that no less than 10 airmen were parachuting to earth at the same time. Oostavern Wood proved a very desolate spot, and it was with great difficulty that the battalion obtained sufficient cover from the cold weather. Most of the dugouts and pillboxes in this devastated wood were underwater. However, being free from enemy observation and the consequent artillery fire made up a great deal for the discomfort. A few days later the battalion went farther back towards Wytschaete, where a fairly clean area was found and better accommodation was discovered. It was a restful time, and some of the more energetic members of the battalion journeyed to Ypres to see the sights. Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Gaze, M.C., left the battalion for a senior officer's course at Camberley, and the command of the battalion was given to Lieutenant Colonel A.C.H. Bank, M.C. Chapter 41. America Corner, the attack crossing the Lies Boos Beck-Ronk, the pursuit towards the River Scheldt, Petty Turcoing Avelgem, the armistice, Courtrai area, march over devastated area via Armentières, Bosingham base duties, the end. On the 11th of October, 1918, the battalion left their camp near Wytschaete and marched to take over the line at America Corner, about 112 miles north of Wervik. This relief entailed a long march of about 12 miles. The first part was done during the morning, when a halt was made under the cover of a small ridge about a mile west of Houtham. The weather was fine, and the enemy artillery did not bother us on this part of the journey. On the way we passed 2 derelict British tanks, relics of our advance in 1917. From the halt, advance parties of an officer and a few NCOs from each company went forward, but it was not until dusk that the battalion was able to continue their march over the canal bridge at Houtham and thence via Tenberlin. The roads were difficult, and as the country had been in enemy hands, many new tracks and roads had been made, and together with the darkness and the inevitable rain which accompanies most marches, attacks, and reliefs, the latter part of the journey became very trying. The advance parties who left earlier in the day came under very heavy artillery fire near their destination, and were met by large parties of British troops who had been gassed, an unpleasant omen. The whole area near America Corner was soaked with gas, and the place was littered with dead horses. The headquarters of the battalion we were to relieve had been reduced to the commanding officer, who lay on the floor of the dugout blinded by the gas, while practically all the remainder of headquarters company had suffered from the gas shells and had been evacuated. The RAMC men, who were busy in this gas-stricken zone, which was still being shelled when the advance parties of our battalion arrived, deserved the highest praise for their devotion to duty. Here, indeed, was a pleasant outlook, and before the battalion had arrived, some of our own advance party had suffered and had to be evacuated, including acting RSM Dyer 364, who, unfortunately, was killed later on in the day, an enemy shell landing right on the ambulance car in which he was traveling some 6 miles farther back. In the evening, heavy rain fell, and the battalion struggled in the dark along the shelled roads which were now covered in thick mud. About 11 p.m., the battalion arrived at America Corner, and fortunately at that time when the shelling had diminished, only to learn that the battalions in the line on both flanks were just about to raid the Boche lines. Before the companies could form up under their guides, a heavy artillery duel opened up, and of course, everyone took immediate cover wherever possible. Luckily, only a few minor casualties resulted, and the relief was continued. The battalion, however, had practically no time to learn anything of their new surroundings before daybreak, as the enemy continued to shell the area throughout the night. When dawn came, it was found that we were under observation from the Boche trenches, and that battalion headquarters was only a matter of 250 yards from the front enemy trenches, and overlooked by Wervik Church, where the enemy had an observation post. Not that there is anything particularly daring about this fact, but battalion headquarters is always the center of attraction for thousands of runners from rear authorities, asking for the quantity of jam, etc. When the real thing to be considered is the enemy artillery and the preparation for the coming attack. Besides, constant callers always make a place conspicuous, even if that place is in a quiet suburban street, and with the perfect observation of the enemy, we had no desire to become conspicuous. Throughout the day, the enemy continued to shell the area, devoting much of his gaseous attentions on America Corner. 2 days were given to us to acquaint ourselves with this sector, and as no movement was possible by day, it meant a great deal of night work and practically no rest. The night before the attack, rations were brought up on pack mules by our quartermaster, Captain Jocelyn, and his assistant, Lieutenant Wright. Both these officers found great difficulty in persuading the mules to come up with the rations, and the prospect of being heavily shelled on the return journey while in charge of these stupid animals was not encouraging for them. However, they were soon relieved. An orderly put his head into the pillbox entrance and gravely informed them that a shell had just arrived and disposed of their 4-footed friends. Wright had a leave warrant for England on the morrow in his pocket, yet he came up to this inferno just to wish us cheerio and good luck, although his attendance was not officially necessary. The attack was ordered for dawn on the 14th of October, 365, and the artillery opened up a most terrific barrage at 5 a.m., and after a 4-minute bombardment of the enemy front lines, the attack was launched under the same heavy volume of artillery fire which gradually crept forward. Jumping-off lines had been laid out the previous night, and from these the battalion advanced close on the creeping barrage in which a great number of smoke shells were used. Within 30 minutes of the commencement of the attack, German prisoners poured into our lines. Apparently under this fierce artillery fire, they had made very little resistance in the front line. No less than 313 prisoners, including 9 officers, passed through our battalion headquarters within a half hour. The 214th attacked on our left, and with us were successful in reaching the first objectives near the railway line from Wervik to Menin. Some individual cases of gallantry reported were Sergeant B. Coulthard, B Company, who, with his platoon, did yeoman work and rounded up 45 of the enemy. Corporal C.D. Lodge, C Company, with his men cleared the wire defenses of a strong point and carried it. Private Oakes, D Company, single-handed rushed an enemy pillbox, put 14 of the enemy out of action with rifle and bombs and then took 10 prisoners. Lance Corporal J. Barnesfather, B Company, and Corporal W. J. Mash, D Company, were not far behind in their performances. All along the line the first rush had succeeded, and under cover of a barrage from our artillery, the battalion halted and consolidated, in preparation for a counterattack. While the attack was proceeding, all occupied areas behind the Boche lines were bombarded with a great number of gas shells. Although the resistance from the Boche troops was small, their artillery was not slow in replying to our fire, and a heavy bombardment of the British lines was soon in full swing. The next step was to exploit this initial success, and to push on up to, and if possible, across, the river Lies, whilst the enemy was still disorganized and his guns on the move. On the right, this involved the clearing of Wervik, in whose narrow streets and half-broken-down houses there were still a good many machine guns and snipers. By this time, the mist and smoke had gone, and the advance was entirely uncovered in any way, for there was practically no ground cover here. Patrols pushed out towards the Lies as soon as the first objective was gained were held up by machine gun fire, and in part, by the old wire that still remained. From the newly captured position, the ground on our direct front sloped gradually to the river Lies, and it was devoid of all cover. In daylight it was impossible to push forward without 366 incurring unnecessary casualties. In the dusk, however, patrols pushed out, and found that the enemy had retired to the farther bank of the river, but had destroyed all the bridges by fire. About midnight, however, A Company, under Captain Duhome, were able to make a crossing by a bridge which had not been quite destroyed, just to the right of our direct front, and afterwards he was able to take his company along the farther bank and form a bridgehead near Bauspec. Under cover of this bridgehead the sappers, under Major Atkinson, R.E., placed a pontoon bridge across the river, though during the whole of its construction the work was hindered by artillery and machine gun fire. Just after dawn the remainder of the battalion crossed the river and occupied Bauspec, a village which had been badly damaged by our artillery. We cleared the village and in the early morning were able to form a defensive line on the far outskirts. It was, however, impossible for us to push on any farther, as we were held up on our direct front by a heavily wired line of trenches known as the Linselles Switch. Furthermore, on our right the situation was not quite clear, and heavy fighting was in progress, while the London Scottish on our left were unable to effect a crossing of the Lies owing to the flat nature of the ground to their front, which was swept by machine gun fire from the high factories on the farther bank nearer Menin. Later in the day, however, the 14th Division had forced a crossing near Wervik, and were able to push up on our right, and on this flank the enemy gradually withdrew. During the afternoon, the London Scottish came over to their right and crossed our pontoon bridge and came into Bauspec. By this time, the enemy had left the Linselles Switch under our pressure, and we were able to occupy the high ground east of the village of Bauspec from Mont de Halluin to Ronc. The line was continued on our right by the 31st Division, which had then pushed through the 14th Division, while on our left the 216th Londons, Queen's Westminsters, continued the line northeast as far as Reckham, having experienced some hard fighting in crossing the Lies just south of Menin by means of rafts made from old doors, duckboards, etc. In the evening the London Scottish moved from Bauspec to Ronc for the night, when they were ordered to continue the pursuit next morning after their night's rest. During the night of the 17th of October the battalion held the Mont de Halluin, Ronc outpost line, but as the Boche was retreating fast and was not expected to make a real stand until he reached the river Scheldt, the night was peaceful, and the civilians in the neighborhood gave our men a hearty welcome. In the farm occupied by battalion headquarters, the Hun had 367 left his playing cards on the table in the middle of a game, while at the piano were fragments of German songs. The next morning the London Scottish continued the pursuit on the brigade front, while the 215th and 216th followed in their wake in column of route, as far as Cruistrat. Not until passing this village did the 214th meet any opposition, but on the ridge, a couple of miles beyond, were many well-placed and concealed enemy machine guns, which arrested their progress. According to plan, the Scottish were to have passed over this ridge that day, but in view of this enemy rearguard were unable to do so. In spite of this temporary holdup, however, our own battalion was ordered to billet in farms practically in the firing line. Remarkable as it may seem, the London Scottish Support Company was actually behind our battalion headquarters, where we were enjoying a nice hot meal and slept in comfortable beds. During the night while we slept, however, the 214th pushed over the ridge, and the next day we resumed our march forward. Except for the visit of a Boche plane which flew over our column and was brought down by Lewis gun fire, the journey to Ailbeck was without incident. That night we were in comfortable billets in private houses and farms near the town which had been untouched by the ravages of war. The station master where the writer was billeted produced an English grammar which he had studied for this day, when British troops should arrive, and consequently spent the evening in questioning us in his labored English. On the following days, the advance was continued by the 214th and 216th battalions, and except for a slight check at Rollingham, where the enemy had 2 field guns firing from the marketplace, little opposition was met. On the 20th, these advance battalions had reached the high ground at St. Genoa overlooking the Scheldt, the patrols of the London Scottish actually reaching the banks of the river that night. However, the enemy resistance showed signs of increase, and heavy artillery fire from the farther banks of the river informed us that the Boche was making a stand here. On the same night, the battalion moved forward towards Petit Tourcoing and were billeted in the farmhouses just behind the St. Genoa ridge. The advance being held up by the German defences on the east bank of the Scheldt, the brigade was withdrawn from the line and remained in billets in the Petit Tourcoing area until the end of the month. As much rest as possible was given to the troops, and in the fine autumn weather sports and football were indulged in. The countryside had not been destroyed by war, and looked very clean and beautiful after the desolation of the Messines area, where the ebb and flow of the Fighting 368 had destroyed nature for miles around. During our stay here, the 30th Divisional Concert Party, the Optimists, gave us an excellent evening's entertainment in one of the large barns, and except for a few practice attacks over the open, we had a restful time. The appearance of homemade rafts on a local pond at the end of the month, however, made us think seriously of watery graves in the Scheldt. On the 1st of November, we were ordered to take over the line at Avelgem on the Scheldt, and after a trying march, we relieved a battalion of the King's Royal Rifles. Although our approach march was disturbed by enemy shelling, we suffered no casualties. Avelgem itself was on the banks of the Scheldt and was overlooked by the Mont d'Encluse, 150 feet on the farther bank. Previous to our recent advance, the town had been a peaceful market town, but now it was battered to the ground by the German artillery, and the last few civilians were leaving in haste when we arrived. The line held by the battalion was on the bank of the river in front of the town and extended north as far as Rug, where a bridgehead on the farther bank had been established. The care of the bridgehead was entrusted to B Company, under Captain Lewis, while the remaining companies occupied cellars in the town and in the farmhouses nearby. Our days were spent underground, as the Boche had complete observation of our lines, but at night our transport brought up rations, and we prepared ourselves for the next day under the ground. Each morning just before dawn the enemy barraged our position with a heavy artillery strafe, no doubt anticipating a further attack from us. On Sunday, the 3rd of November, the Boche concentrated his attentions on Avelgem Church, and in about 6 hours of constant shelling, reduced a most beautiful building into absolute ruin. The following day the battalion was relieved, and returned as far as Knock, about 4 miles farther back. After a night's rest here, a further move was expected, and in the evening orders were actually received from brigade. Billeting parties left for the new area and commenced their work. The battalion soon followed, accompanied by the inevitable rain, only to be turned back on reaching the new area to find that the change had been cancelled. When we returned to our former homes, we found another unit occupying the best places, and it was with difficulty that we found accommodation. However, this crowding only lasted for one night, and the next morning we moved still farther back, a distance of about 6 miles, just to the north of Bellicum. On the 9th of November, the enemy evacuated Mont d'Encluse, and the next day we were brought forward towards the Scheldt, as 369,370 far as Heerstert, just west of Avelgem. On arriving in the village, we found it full of troops and heard rumors that British cavalry had passed through earlier in the day. At the same time, however, a German Taube was hovering overhead, and we anticipated a bombing raid that night. We realized that the Boche had retired so far that his artillery was unlikely to trouble us, but we hated this inquisitive, plane circling overhead. That night rumors of an armistice became prevalent. Everyone turned out of his billet, and led by our drum and fife band, we paraded up and down the main street of the village. In the midst of this excitement, however, news came from brigade that no official news had been received confirming the rumored cessation of hostilities, and this so depressed us that we gradually faded away one by one to our billets. The next morning ordinary routine was pursued, and no one dared to utter the word armistice without receiving disparaging remarks from his hearers. About 9 a.m., however, the official telegram came through and the rumor of the previous night was confirmed. All the excitement of an armistice, however, had been squashed the previous night. The sting had gone. During the afternoon, a Thanksgiving service was held in the local church. The battalion remained at Heerstert until the 15th November, and many took advantage of the opportunity of visiting the enemy defenses on the banks of the Scheldt under more peaceful conditions than anticipated. A couple of large fatigue parties were furnished for work at Escanafels on the east of the river, but difficulty arose with regard to the supply of rations, etc., and the battalion was withdrawn and marched back to the St. Anne's area, south of Courtrai, which had now become an important railhead. The rest here was much appreciated, and beyond the passing of military transport there were no signs of war. Parades were held in the morning, but the remainder of the day was devoted to games, chiefly football. Passes to Courtrai were freely granted. A ceremonial parade for the presentation of medal ribbons was held on the 26th of November on the local aerodrome, and beyond the preparation for this parade little demand was made on the energy of the troops. On the 30th of November, orders were received to move back still further to the St. Omer area, and this necessitated a 5 days trek. The first day's halt was made at Lincelles, where we saw the terrible effect of the British artillery fire during the attack over the River Lys in October, and also the wanton destruction of the Hun hordes, who had deliberately broken furniture and mirrors, and had slashed the covering from upholstered furniture. The night's billets were very uncomfortable, 371, but as it was for one night, only no one troubled. The next day we proceeded to Verlicum, and here we were quartered in an extensive hut encampment, which the Germans had cleverly concealed from aerial observation, in a thick wood. A comfortable night was spent here in the bunks so recently vacated by our enemies. All along the route to this point were signs of the hurried retreat of the Boche, and we wondered why he had left such strongly defended points with so little real resistance. In places, the wire entanglements were 30 yards in depth, through which no troops could advance without a terrible massacre. The third day's journey took us to Armentières, and it was appalling to see this great town practically razed to the ground. Undoubtedly, the retiring Hun had blown up many of the fine buildings and churches by mines, and except for a few French troops wandering about the ruins, there was no sign of human habitation. The day's march ended at Sailly-sur-l'Allies, and here in absolute desolation, the cover of dugouts and tumble-down buildings, the battalion rested for the night. Opposite battalion headquarters on the main road was a huge German cemetery containing no less than 9,000 numbered graves, a grim relic of the heavy fighting in this area in March 1918, the dates on the crosses being evidence of the period. Many French peasants were wandering aimlessly over the fields, looking for their lost treasures, and it was pathetic to see them building temporary homes with the old material, such as ammunition boxes, corrugated iron, biscuit tins, and so forth, which littered the old battlefield. The following morning the march was continued through Astères and Merville, and the same devastation greeted us all round. It was not until evening time, when approaching St. Venant, that we met occupied farms where the occupants carried out their daily toil regardless of the adjoining desolation. A short journey on the 4th of December, just south of the Neep Forest, brought us to our destination at Bosingham, a few miles northeast of Ayr, when Lieutenant Colonel Gaze rejoined from England and again took over the command. Billets were soon arranged and improved on our acquaintance, combined with hard work and cleaning, which did a great deal towards this improvement. Arrangements were immediately made for Christmas time, and when the 25th of December arrived, everything was carried out with great success, although doubts were entertained until the very last minute as to whether the goods would arrive in time. At Bosingham, touch with our 1st Battalion in the Lillers area was obtained, and inter-battalion football matches were arranged. From this time the battalion commenced to fade away. The fighting over, demobilization set in, and every day some familiar faces left the battalion to re-enter civil life. Early 372, in January, the battalion moved to Etaples, where after a stay of about 9 days, they entrained for the Dunkirk area and encamped at Mardyk. In February, the battalion, much depleted in strength, developed into a general purposes battalion and carried out base duties. In the following month, they were relieved of these duties and moved to Pont de Petite Cintre, only to be moved again by train to the Etaples area, first staying at Dans and then at Saint-Cécile-Plage. From here, C and D companies were detailed for duty at a prisoner-of-war camp near Boulogne. In May, a further move was made towards Abbeville, and a new home was found in the Siquier area. Demobilization increased at a great pace, and by September, only 155 other ranks remained. Canteen stores were sold to another regiment, and without canteen stores, no regiment can exist. 3rd Battalion Civil Service Rifles, by Major H. Duncan Lewis. The 3rd, subsequently the Reserve Battalion, was raised in May 1915 for the purpose of furnishing drafts to the 1st and 2nd Battalions. Lieutenant Colonel R.C. Hayes, T.D., relinquishing the command of the 2nd Battalion, was appointed commanding officer, and retained the position until he was disabled by an unfortunate accident during a Madsen gun demonstration on the miniature rifle range at Wimbledon in May 1918. He was succeeded by Lieutenant Colonel C. M. Mackenzie, DSO, who commanded the 2nd Battalion of the Kensingtons in France and Palestine. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie remained with the battalion until it was broken up shortly after the armistice, when he was appointed commandant of the demobilization camp at Wimbledon. The men were at first billeted at their homes and assembled daily at Somerset House for preliminary organization, drill and route marching. Richmond Park. After a short period, the battalion went into camp at Richmond Park with other third-line units of the 1st and 2nd London TF divisions, under Brigadier General C.S.O. Monk. Living together in camp made it possible to commence instilling into the men that sense of military discipline, which is the first qualification of a soldier, and progress in this direction soon became apparent. At first the training was necessarily on somewhat elementary lines owing to various causes, such as the want of experienced officers and NCOs, lack of arms and equipment, etc. But in the course of time, as these disabilities became gradually less and the syllabus of training more systematized, there followed marked improvement. An early difficulty felt by the commanding officer was in regard to senior officers. A number of smart and promising junior officers had been posted to the battalion, many of whom later on served with distinction at the front, both in France and Palestine, but at the time they were new to military duties. This difficulty was met to a great extent by the transfer, first, of 374 Major G.W. Turk from the 101st Provisional Battalion, and shortly afterwards, of Major H.D. Lewis from the 2nd Battalion. In August 1915, when the latter officer was transferred, the organization of the battalion consisted of 2 companies of 6 strong platoons each. Captain C.J. Bowen was gazetted as adjutant, which post he held until August 1917, when he was seconded for service in East Africa. He was succeeded in turn by Captains R.F. Guyton, W.L.C. Rathbone, M.C. A.M., and F.C. Olive. The important post of quartermaster was filled by the appointment of Captain W.G. Hodge, late quartermaster sergeant of the 2nd Battalion, and except for a period of 10 months, when he exchanged duties with Captain A. Toomey, of the 1st Battalion, he remained with the battalion until the end. It is difficult to overestimate his services. His untiring zeal and efficiency, combined with firmness and tact, have given him a place in the front rank of those officers who have served the regiment in a similar capacity. He was ably assisted by Regimental Quartermaster Sergeant J. S. McIntyre, until the latter went overseas early in 1918. The battalion was very fortunate in its medical officer, Captain F.M. Hughes. He endeared himself to all ranks by his kindly interest in, and attention to, all his patients, and when he left for France, the whole battalion turned out to give him a send-off. Everyone learnt with gratification that he was the recipient later of the Legion of Honor for gallant conduct. Sergeant Major G. Weaver was appointed regimental sergeant major, and was succeeded in 1917 by Sergeant Major B. J. Jolliffe, from the 1st Battalion. Barnes. The battalion remained under canvas in Richmond Park until the 20th November, the last few weeks under trying conditions of cold and wet, and was then transferred to billets in Barnes. Here training was continued for 6 weeks under the disadvantages consequent upon the separation of the men at the close of each day's work. Hazely Down. Early in January 1916, the battalion was moved to Hazely Down, 312 miles to the south of Winchester, where a camp of considerable size was formed, consisting mainly of third-line units of the 2nd London TF divisions, including at first the Kensingtons and the Queen's Westminsters, and later, when these 2 battalions left, the London Scottish, the 3 other battalions of the 4th Reserve London Brigade. The camp was situated in an ideal position on the southern slope of one of the many downs in the neighborhood. With stretches of well-wooded country, intersected by good roads, it formed altogether a most suitable region for military training. There was a range close by, at Chilcombe. There were trenches on Folly Down, about a mile away, and at the camp there was plenty of space for digging and bombing and assault courses, as well as a good miniature range. For 2 years, the greater part of its life, the battalion made its home at this camp, and from here draft after draft was sent out, mainly to the 1st, partly to the 2nd Battalion, and occasionally to other units at the respective fronts. The drafts had been trained, thanks very largely to the efforts of the disabled officers and NCOs from overseas, as far as possible in the limited time at disposal. When leave was given at the beginning of 1917 to enroll boys of 18, the strength of the battalion mounted rapidly, and for some months stood at a total of about 2,400. These lads were of an excellent type, and as it was possible to give them a much longer training than the other recruits, they became quite good soldiers, and many of them proved suitable for, and were given, commissions. Under the special recruiting system, admirably worked by Lieutenant C. Doubleday, officer commanding depot, the ranks of the battalion were reinforced by much the same class of man as joined the regiment in pre-war days. When that system ceased, in 1918, the battalion had to accept whatever men were sent to it by the recruiting officer, but particular pains were taken, and with great success, to imbue them with a sense of the best traditions of the regiment. Indeed, throughout its career, whether on or off duty, both in billets and in camp, the conduct of the battalion was worthy of the regimental badge. While at Hazely, the battalion was organized in 6 companies as follows: A. Major G. W. Turk, B. Major H. D. Lewis, C and D. various officers mostly from overseas, amongst others, Majors F. M. Warren and E. W. Niels, Captains A. C. Bull, L. D. Eccles, D. H. Mile, W. L. C. Rathbone, M. C. A. M. E. Captain G. H. Stone. F. Men from overseas, various officers from overseas. Attached to B. Company were machine gun and signaling detachments under the command of Lieutenants A. E. Smith and O. H. Madison, respectively. The gradually increasing number of experienced officers and NCOs returning from overseas, either from partial disablement or for periods of rest, rendered most valuable service by 376 furnishing the battalion with instructors in all branches of training. Exceptionally good was the work of the musketry staff, in charge, successively, of Captain H. A. Barry, Lieutenants J. A. G. Faulkner and C. S. McKay, and of the physical exercises staff, under Captain H. G. Edney. As regards messing, the men were well looked after, as was always the case in the regiment, which has been particularly fortunate in its quartermasters. The food was good and varied, and the arrangements generally were on several occasions the subject of most favorable comment on the part of inspecting officers. Sergeant T. V. Weaver rendered valuable service with this work. The Regimental Institute, which had been started in Richmond Park, with Major H. D. Lewis as PRI, was much developed at Hazely, and as there were plenty of funds forthcoming from the rebate on the canteen money, everything was done to make the institute attractive. The GOC Southern District, on the occasion of a visit to it in 1917, said that it was one of the best he had seen in the command. Liberal grants were made for the purpose of adding to the men's comfort and towards meeting the expenditure on games and sports. Shortly before leaving Richmond, permission had been given to form a band, subject to the proviso that fit men were not withheld from draft, and while at Barnes, and during the first year at Hazley, the battalion possessed a really good brass band. But as the men composing it were gradually dispersed, its place was taken by quite a fair drum and fife band. Close touch was kept with the 1st Battalion in France, and while at Hazley visits which were much appreciated in the battalion were paid by Lieutenant Colonel W. H. E. Segrave, DSO, and by the late Major F. W. Parrish, DSO, MC, both of whom had endeared themselves to the regiment. Wimbledon. On Saturday, December 22, 1917, the battalion said goodbye to Hazley Down and entrained for Wimbledon, where it went into camp with the 3rd Line units of the Queen's Westminsters and the 17th London, and where it remained until disbanded at the end of 1918. Here the work of training was carried on as earnestly as at Hazley, varied with occasional air raid alarms, culminating in that of Whitsunday. In May 1918 occurred the serious accident to Colonel Hayes, which caused his retirement from the command, and about the same time another change also took place. Brigadier General H. P. Byrne, CMG, DSO of the Gordon Highlanders, from the 377 famous 51st Highland Division, succeeded Brigadier General C. S. O. Monk in command of the brigade. In October, Major H. D. Lewis was appointed officer commanding depot, and was followed in the command of B Company by Lieutenant L. C. Morris, MC, a young officer, who distinguished himself while in command of a company of the 1st Battalion in the fighting at Burlon Wood. Shortly after the armistice, the battalion was broken up, most of the men not due for demobilization being transferred to the 6th London Regiment at Blackdown, and the officers to the 9th London, also in the Aldershot Command. The number of recruits that passed through the 3rd Battalion was approximately 6,000. Regimental Aid Fund. In July 1916, Sir John Lithaby, a former member of the regiment, inaugurated a fund with the object of providing comforts for the men at the front, food and other necessaries for the prisoners of war, and temporary help, where needed, for the widows and dependents of men killed. An influential committee, representative of almost all the government departments, was formed, with an executive committee consisting of past and present officers of the regiment, with Sir H. J. Gibson, KCB, as chairman, and Sir John Lithaby as honorary secretary. The appeal for subscriptions met with a ready response. £2,850 was received for the general objects of the fund, chiefly from the public offices and the officers and men of the regiment, while a further £5,000 was subscribed for the prisoners of war, by the regiment, the public departments, the Central Prisoners of War Committee, and the relatives and friends of the men themselves. The comforts most appreciated by the battalions overseas seemed to be luxuries wherewith to supplement the ordinary rations, and consignments of various kinds were, from time to time, sent out from home both to France and Palestine. In addition, the commanding officers were supplied with funds to use at their discretion in brightening the somber monotony of trench life whenever opportunity offered. The appeals from widows and dependents were fewer than had been expected, but many necessitous cases were helped in a quiet and unobtrusive way. The chief activities of the fund were connected with the care of the prisoners of war, of whom there were about 210 at the date of the armistice, scattered throughout the various prison camps in Germany and Palestine. Each man was provided at intervals with a complete outfit of clothing, and 3 food parcels with bread, tobacco, and cigarettes were sent to him every fortnight. This work was carried out at the depot under the direction of the officer commanding, Captain C. E. Doubleday. Most of the parcels reached their destination safely, and the men, on their return after the armistice, expressed great appreciation of what had been done for them. Only a few, happily, had to complain of exceptionally harsh treatment at the hands of their German captors. In accordance with its rules, the aid fund was closed early in 1921, and the General Committee, with the approval of the Charity Commissioners, disposed of the unexpended balance of £1,929 by presenting £1,500 to the Old Comrades Association, and the remainder to the officer commanding the regiment to be applied to the erection of a memorial to the officers and men who had fallen during the war. See Doubleday, 379. Chapter 43. The Reconstituted Battalion. The first step towards securing the future of the battalion may be said to have been taken when Friends of the Regiment in 1918 approached authority with a view to the Prince of Wales assuming the honorary colonelcy, so long held by his grandfather, but it had been considered advisable to wait the termination of hostilities. In 1919, however, a letter was received from the Controller to His Royal Highness, stating that the Prince of Wales would accept the position. The appointment which followed in due course was received with unbounded delight in the regiment. Many months of delay on the part of the Army Council in forming their post-war policy in regard to the territorial force had a most deleterious effect, and thus when the task of reconstituting the regiment was commenced, many difficulties were experienced. The bands of comradeship had loosened, and there was a marked disinclination among the greater part of those who had worn khaki for so long in war to put it on again in peace, whilst the absence of a young entry into civil service destroyed our main source of recruits. The command of the regiment was offered to Major Viscount Barry, M.C., Special Reserve Scots Guards, who accepted and was appointed lieutenant colonel in February 1920. He was thus the third of his name to have the honor of commanding the regiment. A letter was received on behalf of Lord Grenfell, colonel of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, pointing out that during the war the Civil Service Rifles, among other battalions, had been affiliated by Army Council instructions to the regiment of which he was chief, and requesting that the feeling of the regiment as to the continuance of the connection should be made known to him in reply. Answer was accordingly made that though the regiment highly appreciated the honor of having been linked to the tradition of so distinguished a corps, yet they now felt that they would like to stand on the merits of their war record rather than to shelter, under the magnificent reputation, in the making of which they had not taken 380 part. It was added that the regiment had for years carried out line drill, and had only for a short period drilled as riflemen. The commanding officer was fortunate in securing as adjutant, Captain, Brevet Major, W. H. Ramsbotham of the West Yorkshire Regiment, Prince of Wales's own. He also applied successfully to the Coldstream Guards for a regimental sergeant major in the person of C.S.M. Stevens, D.C.M., and later, through the instrumentality of General Jeffreys, 2 sergeant instructors were obtained from the same regiment. Captain A. A. Jocelyn was appointed quartermaster, a position he held in the 2nd Battalion throughout the war. Captain A. E. Evans, RAMC, who had served in that capacity with the 1st Battalion in France, was appointed medical officer. The following officers and NCOs were appointed to the various companies. A company: Major H. F. M. Warren, Captain G. E. Thompson, DSO, Lieutenant F. W. Hounsell, CSM Hyder, CQMS Lewis, MM. B. Company: Captain R. J. S. Gold, Captain P. Davenport, MC, Lieutenants S. A. Sayes, MC. J. L. Hutchison, MC, CSM Torbell, CQMS F. Trout. C. Company: Captain L. D. Eccles, Captain H. M. Blomfield, from 5th Buffs, Lieutenant P. E. Beto, 2nd Lieutenant J. S. Oldcorn, DCM, CQMS Ibbott, MM, and Sergeant ACSM, A.C. Ridlington, MC. D. Company: Captain T. N. Sherratt, Lieutenant W. D. Hooper, Lieutenant P. H. Hall, CSM Collingham, CQMS Sale. Recruiting started slowly, and by midsummer some 80 members had joined, to which number was added the band of 24 members, under Band Sergeant H. W. Blackmore. The band had all served in this capacity on the Western Front with the 1st Battalion. It was felt that there was no better way of influencing recruiting than by reviving the annual midsummer camp. This battalion, alone of the 2nd London Division, was fortunate in obtaining leave for this, and a contingent of the regiment, under command of Major Warren, spent a happy fortnight at St. Martin's Plain, Shorncliffe. RSM Stevens at this camp earned the commendation of the GOC London District, General Jeffreys, for the remarkable progress made by recruits under his zealous teaching. After camp recruiting began to quicken in pace, the sergeant's mess was re-established. The custom of holding 2 yearly dinners of the officers' mess had been revived, and the first of these was held in November. Among the guests was 381 the newly appointed commander of the 4th, Grey London Infantry Brigade, Colonel F. G. Lewis. Subsequently, HRH the Prince of Wales was approached, and he honored the regiment by attending the mess dinner held in the Alexandra Room of the Trocadero on the 4th April, 1921. There were also present Sir Warren Fisher, KCB, Secretary to Treasury, Sir Henry Gibson, Auditor General, Major General Jeffreys, GOC London District, Sir Neville Smythe, VC GOC 47th, 2nd London Division, Colonel F. G. Lewis, Holland Martin, Esquire, CBE, Chairman County of London Territorial Force Association, and many old commanding officers of the regiment, including Colonel A. M. Rennie, Lieutenant Colonel Segrave, Lieutenant Colonel R. Fielding, Lieutenant Colonel W. F. K. Newson, Lieutenant Colonel A. W. Gaze, Colonel R. G. Hayes, T.D., Major A. C. H. Bank, Sir John Litheby and Sir Charles Walker, KCB. A third dinner, held in November 1921, at the Civil Service Rifles Club, was honored by the attendance of Lieutenant General Sir Francis Lloyd, GCVO, who in an admirable speech gave encouragement to those who are working hard for the continued existence and future of their regiment. During the time which had elapsed since the armistice, the activities of the regiment had been kept well in the public view. The regiment had taken part in the processional march of the London troops in 1919, when the representatives of the 1st and 2nd Battalions were led respectively by Lieutenant Colonel Fielding and Lieutenant Colonel Gaze. At the unveiling by the Duke of York of the memorial to London troops erected in front of the Royal Exchange, and on the occasion of the presentation of colours to battalions of the 56th Division at the Horse Guards, parade by HRH Princess Mary, it had helped, in company with other troops of the 47th Division, to line the parade ground. The regiment also sent detachments to the unveiling of the memorial to King Edward Roman VII, and also to the unveiling of the memorial to those men of the post office, many of whom served in the regiment, who fell in the late war. At Easter 1921, the pre-war custom of a visit to the Guards Depot at Caterham was revived, and over 100 other ranks received the traditional hospitality and welcome from all ranks of the depot. This was a great success and had much influence on recruiting. After this camp, great efforts were made by members of the regiment, and the effects were just beginning to be shown, when an event disastrous to the regiment, as far as recruiting was concerned, occurred. For the month previous to April 1921, recruits had been coming in at the rate of 12 to 15 per week, and had that rate of increase been maintained, 382, a satisfactory increase of strength would have been seen by midsummer. In April 1921, the Defence Force was formed. Members of HM Civil Service were forbidden to join. The headquarters staff were taken away, and headquarters given up to a force which had nothing in common with the regiment. With the exception of shooting, all its activities were suspended. For over 3 months, this state of affairs continued and had a blighting effect on the regimental prosperity. The other regiments of the division, on the disbandment of the Defence Force, secured a large number of recruits from those who had served in the defence unit bearing their names, whilst the Civil Service Rifles, through no fault of their own, lost not only those who would have joined had not the Defence Force been formed, but received merely a few individuals as recruits from among all those who had enlisted in the Defence Force. In spite of these difficulties, the task was resumed. The regimental shooting program, seriously curtailed, was carried out, while in July 1921, at the first post-war camp of the Grey Brigade at Shorncliffe, over 200 other ranks attended. The regiment there maintained its reputation for efficiency, and the battalion signallers under Sergeant Maddox earned commendation by the inspecting officer of being the best trained signallers in the division, whilst the band, by their excellent performances on the lees at Folkestone and in camp, brought themselves into deserved prominence. In the world of sport, the battalion team reached the semi-final of the Divisional Football Championship, whilst the Civil Service Rifles Harriers gained second place in the cross-country championship. The season's shooting at Bisley was crowned by winning the Middlesex Cup on 10 September 1921, this cup conferring the primacy for the year on the regimental team over those from all territorial units in the 6 home counties. Relative to the winning of this trophy, a letter was received from the Secretary to the Prince of Wales expressing His Royal Highness's pleasure. Accompanying the letter was a large signed photograph of HRH, which, sent as it was on the eve of the departure of HRH on his visit to India, gave to all ranks highest gratification, as evidence of the support and interest felt for his own civil service rifles by the Prince of Wales.